Hello story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. It was supposed to be just another typical day for me. Nothing out of the ordinary, just another workday. Just another routine. The usual grind of morning coffee, the dull hum of traffic, and the endless barrage of emails that would soon bombard my inbox. But then, I found myself in the one situation that would forever change the way I look at elevators. I work in a rather nondescript office building in the heart of the city, one of those places where the days blur together, and every office space feels eerily similar to the last. The building itself wasn't anything special, just a standard modern structure, the kind you might walk past without ever giving it a second thought. The walls were adorned with generic artwork, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their dull white light offering no comfort. It wasn't the place that would give anyone a sense of wonder or amazement. It was just an office building. My day started like any other. I arrived at work a bit earlier than usual, hoping to beat the rush of coworkers who always seemed to get to the building minutes before the clock struck 9. The elevator ride up was uneventful as always. A short ascent to the 12th floor where my office was located. It was an ordinary elevator, not particularly old, but also not one of the newer, high-tech ones you might find in fancier buildings. It was functional, the kind that gets you where you need to go, but nothing more. I pressed the button for the 12th floor, leaning against the polished metal wall as the elevator slowly ascended. I didn't think much of it. I was distracted, my mind already thinking about the first task of the day, the countless emails I had to respond to, the meeting with my boss, and the reports that needed updating. I had no idea what awaited me in that elevator, and certainly no clue how everything was about to change in a matter of minutes. When the elevator dinged, signaling my arrival at the 12th floor, I stepped out without a second thought. The usual office chatter greeted me as I walked through the open-plan workspace, my colleagues already immersed in their own little worlds. Some were on the phone, some typing furiously on their laptops, and some just having a quiet conversation over their morning coffee. As I settled into my desk, I couldn't help but notice that there was an odd stillness about the day. It wasn't anything overt, but there was something about the atmosphere that felt different. I dismissed it, though after all, it was probably nothing more than the fatigue from a long week. But as I went about my work, the feeling lingered in the back of my mind. It wasn't until the afternoon that I had to take another trip down to the lobby for a quick meeting. It was then that the true horror began. As I stepped into the elevator once again, I noticed something was off. At first, I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The air in the elevator felt heavier, as though the space was crowded, even though there was no one else inside with me. The lights flickered briefly, but that wasn't so unusual for an office building. I've seen far worse, after all. I pressed the button for the lobby and waited, casually glancing at my phone to check my email. The elevator hummed as it started its descent, but then, the lights flickered again. And then again. The elevator jerked slightly, as if something was wrong. I didn't think much of it. Elevators have hiccups from time to time, right? But then, it happened again. The elevator came to a sudden halt, mid-descent. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I pressed the emergency button instinctively, the red light flashing above me. The intercom crackled to life with a mechanical voice, telling me they would send someone to fix the issue. But there was something about the tone that made me feel uneasy. It wasn't comforting. It was distant, almost robotic. I tried not to panic. After all, I had been stuck in elevators before, and they always got me out eventually. But this time felt different. There was a chill in the air, something I couldn't explain. It felt wrong, as if the building itself had somehow shifted into something foreign. The metallic walls around me felt colder, as though they were closing in, tightening like a vice. I pressed the emergency button again, but this time, the lights flickered more violently. The elevator began to rock slightly, as if something or someone was trying to break through. In those moments, the world outside felt distant, like I was no longer part of it. The stillness in the air was replaced by an oppressive silence that enveloped me. It was as though the elevator had become a tiny capsule, suspended in time, holding me captive. No matter how many times I pressed the emergency button or tried to call for help, nothing seemed to change. The temperature inside dropped, and the sense of being watched crept over me. I turned slowly, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the elevator remained empty. I laughed nervously, brushing the feeling aside as nothing more than my imagination. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The elevator was still, unnervingly so, suspended between floors. My finger hovered over the emergency button again, but I stopped myself. I didn't want to appear too frantic, though I could already feel the panic building in my chest. The air had grown cold in a way that made my breath visible, like I was standing outside on a frigid winter day. My mind raced through scenarios, trying to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was a power surge. Maybe the elevator's old system was just malfunctioning. After all, the building wasn't exactly new, and elevators in older buildings had their quirks. I decided to calm myself down. There was no reason to overreact. I had been in this situation before, stuck in elevators during maintenance, or worse, during rush hour with dozens of other passengers. But this felt different. The silence that wrapped itself around me was so profound, it was almost suffocating. It was as if the building had shut everything out, leaving me alone in this confined space. I leaned back against the cold metal wall and tried to steady my breathing. Maybe it was the long hours at work getting to me, or maybe I was just overtired. But there was something off, a creeping sensation I couldn't shake, as though unseen eyes were watching me from every corner of the small elevator. The seconds stretched on, feeling like minutes, and that's when I noticed it. The lights above flickered again, but this time they didn't flicker like they had before. It wasn't just a quick strobe that a malfunction might cause. The light above me dimmed, almost to the point of being completely dark, before suddenly bursting back to life, brighter than before. The intensity of the light was unsettling. It cast sharp shadows that made the elevator walls seem to move, as if they were alive, breathing. The walls felt like they were pressing closer, the metal groaning under an invisible weight. I froze, eyes wide, watching the walls. My heart pounded harder in my chest as the elevator jerked again. Not a typical mechanical jolt, but one that felt deliberate, like a hand reaching out and nudging the elevator from below. It sent a shiver down my spine, and I instinctively took a step back, my breath quickening. I glanced at the control panel. The floor indicator showed I hadn't moved. I hadn't heard any sounds of the elevator descending or ascending. It was as if I were suspended in some sort of void, with no sound, no movement, no sense of time. I pressed the emergency button once more, but this time the response was different. The intercom crackled to life, but it didn't offer the usual mechanical message that someone would assist me. Instead, the voice was slow, almost distorted. The words didn't come out in their typical, clear tone, but rather in a deep, guttural voice that echoed in my ears. The voice spoke in a whisper, and though it was faint, I could hear the words. "You're not supposed to be here." My blood ran cold. I blinked, unsure if I had heard it correctly. Maybe I was imagining things, the stress of being trapped in the elevator and the quiet atmosphere playing tricks on my mind. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself involuntarily glancing toward the corners of the elevator. The feeling of being watched intensified, the air around me thick with something I couldn't name. I quickly pressed the emergency button again, but this time the lights above flickered erratically, and the voice didn't return. It was gone, leaving behind a heavy silence. I exhaled, trying to regain my composure. It was just a malfunction, right? It had to be. There was no other explanation. But as I looked around, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The elevator didn't feel like a simple mechanical device anymore. It felt like something more, something alive, as though it had become aware of my presence. I waited in the unnatural stillness for what felt like an eternity, but there was no response. The elevator hadn't moved, and the emergency call system seemed to be completely unresponsive. I looked up at the ceiling, trying to calm myself, when I noticed something that made my stomach churn. A faint scratch mark appeared on the metal wall opposite me, like something or someone had been dragged across it. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it was just a trick of the light. But no, the scratch marks were real, deep grooves in the elevator's otherwise pristine metal surface. They seemed fresh, as though they had only just appeared. My heart hammered in my chest, and I instinctively backed away from the wall, my body trembling with fear. I reached for my phone, hoping to call someone, anyone. But of course, there was no signal. It was just another cruel reminder of how alone I was in that elevator. I cursed under my breath. Why hadn't I brought my portable charger with me today? I could feel my thoughts spiraling, each passing moment more unsettling than the last. I needed to get out. I pressed the emergency button again, this time holding it down, my finger pressing hard against the cold metal. The lights flickered once more, and just as I was about to let out a frustrated sigh, the intercom buzzed back to life. But this time, the voice was unmistakable. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't distorted. It was human, slow, deliberate. Leave now, while you still can. The words echoed through the elevator, sending a cold rush of fear through my body. I froze, my hand still on the button, and slowly looked around the small, confined space. There was nothing out of place. The walls were the same as they had been moments ago. The lights flickered once more, but I wasn't sure if it was from the elevator's malfunction or if it was something else. A chill ran down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I looked down at the control panel. The floor indicator was still frozen, and the only sound in the elevator was my own breath and the faint hum of the building's machinery, a sound that had never felt so ominous before. Suddenly, the elevator lurched forward. It wasn't the smooth descent or ascent that I had expected. It was violent, the entire thing shaking as though something inside had been jolted awake. I was thrown off balance, my body jerking to the side, and I grabbed onto the railing, barely managing to keep my footing. The lights flickered again, casting strange, erratic shadows across the walls. I heard it then, the faintest sound, almost imperceptible. It was a soft, scraping noise, like something dragging itself along the floor beneath me. I looked down, my heart skipping a beat, but there was nothing. Nothing but the empty, cold metal floor of the elevator. But the noise continued. It was getting closer, slowly, methodically, as if something was crawling, dragging itself toward me. My pulse raced. My hands were clammy as I gripped the railing, the only anchor in the madness that was unfolding. The noise was getting louder now, too loud to ignore. And then, without warning, the lights went out. The darkness inside the elevator felt suffocating, as if the very air had thickened into something tangible, pressing against me. My mind raced as I blinked repeatedly, trying to adjust to the lack of light. I could feel the cold metal walls closing in on me, the silence oppressive and heavy, like the elevator itself was holding its breath. I reached out with shaky hands, searching for the emergency button, but my fingers brushed only the cold, smooth surface of the metal. There was no sign of the button. It had vanished. My breath caught in my throat as panic began to creep in once more. Where had it gone? I was losing track of time. Was I imagining things? No, I wasn't imagining anything. The elevator had gone dark, and the button I relied on was gone, leaving me utterly powerless. I could still hear the faint scraping sound. It hadn't stopped. If anything, it was getting closer. It felt as though whatever was moving inside the dark space below me was inching closer, its presence undeniable. I held my breath, straining to hear. The dragging sound was followed by something else, something I hadn't noticed before. A soft, rhythmic tapping began. It was subtle at first, a series of delicate, measured taps, like someone knocking on the walls, trying to get my attention. The sound seemed to echo off the walls, growing louder and more deliberate with each passing second. I turned in every direction, my ears ringing, heart racing, but there was nothing. No one. No explanation. Just the sound. I grabbed my phone, desperate to use the flashlight, but of course, there was no signal. No help would come. The tapping continued, now accompanied by something else, a faint, low hum. The kind of sound you'd hear from an old, broken machine or something malfunctioning in the dark. I held the phone in front of me, its weak beam of light illuminating only a few inches ahead. I could barely make out the outlines of the elevator's buttons and the walls, but nothing else. The dim glow was almost laughable compared to the intensity of the darkness around me. The scratching sound grew louder. My heart hammered in my chest, and my breathing became ragged as my mind worked furiously to make sense of it all. My eyes darted back and forth, searching for any sign of movement, but the elevator remained eerily still. The humming continued, vibrating through the floor beneath me, causing the hairs on my arms to stand on end. Then, without warning, the tapping stopped. In the unnatural silence that followed, I stood frozen, barely able to breathe, my mind scrambling to figure out what was happening. The air felt thicker now, charged with an oppressive energy that I couldn't explain. The temperature in the elevator had dropped once again, and my breath was visible as I exhaled, thick and rapid. And then the walls groaned. It wasn't the usual mechanical creaking you'd expect from an elevator. No, this was different. It was deep, resonating through the very metal, like the sound of something ancient and powerful shifting in the darkness. I felt it more than I heard it, the vibrations shaking through my feet, traveling up my legs, making my knees weaken. The entire structure of the elevator felt like it was moving, bending, changing. I stepped back, my mind racing with wild thoughts. Was the building shifting? Had I somehow ended up in some other dimension? My pulse quickened at the thought. But no, this wasn't some science fiction story. This was real. The elevator had to be malfunctioning. It had to be. But then something happened that I couldn't explain. From the darkness, a faint light appeared, just a glimmer at first, like a distant star. It flickered in and out, teasing me with its presence, but it wasn't coming from the emergency light above. No, this light was something else. It seemed to be emanating from the very walls themselves, pulsing, glowing faintly at first, then growing in intensity until it illuminated the entire elevator in a soft, sickly glow. I could see everything now, the walls, the control panel, the scratch marks. But what unnerved me the most were the shapes on the walls. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, but they didn't disappear. The shapes were subtle at first, faint shadows clinging to the corners of the walls, the edges of the door. They twisted and writhed like dark, formless figures. The longer I stared at them, the clearer they became. They seemed to move, but not in the way a normal shadow would. They weren't static. They had a purpose, a direction. I reached forward, trying to press the emergency button again, my fingers trembling with fear. But as I reached for it, the floor beneath me shifted once more. The elevator lurched, but this time, it wasn't the same mechanical jerk. It was smoother, deliberate, like something was guiding it. A deep, heavy weight pressed down on me, like the elevator itself was being pulled by something stronger than gravity. The light flickered again, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. The elevator hung in the balance, suspended between two worlds, and I felt like I was drowning in the stillness. But then, the tapping returned. It was louder now, more insistent, as though someone was trying to get my attention, but there was no one in the elevator with me. No one to explain the sounds, the strange lights, the feeling of being pulled deeper into the unknown. I forced myself to calm down, but the panic was overwhelming. I needed to get out. I slammed my fist against the wall in frustration, desperate for some kind of response, any kind of action from the elevator. But the only thing I received in return was another chilling sound, a low growl, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder, vibrating the very air around me. It wasn't a mechanical sound. No, this was something living. something else. I backed away, my mind racing for some rational explanation, but none came. The growl persisted, deepening, like a distant animal on the hunt. The walls trembled beneath me, and the elevator itself seemed to be shuddering, groaning with unnatural force. The light flickered again, and I could have sworn that for just a brief moment, I saw a face, a twisted, shadowy face appearing from the darkness in the corner of the elevator. Its eyes were hollow, empty sockets, staring straight through me. I stumbled back, my hands trembling, trying to make sense of the impossible. I looked around, searching for any way to escape, but the doors were sealed tight, the walls unchanged. The light pulsed with that same sickly glow, casting shadows that seemed to dance and swirl, growing larger, more pronounced with each passing second. The growl was louder now, louder than the humming, louder than the scraping, louder than anything I had heard before. It was deafening, and it felt as if the very walls of the elevator were alive, closing in on me, suffocating me in their darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The growl, the lights, the movement. The elevator was still. But now, the silence felt even more oppressive than before, and I could feel it, the unmistakable presence of something behind me. The elevator had become my personal prison, a suffocating box that seemed to hold its breath just as much as I was. I could hear the faint hum of the lights above, the low vibration of the floor beneath me. The quiet had become unbearable, and my nerves were frayed. I had no sense of time anymore. It felt like I'd been stuck in that small, metallic space for hours, maybe longer. Then, suddenly, a sound broke the silence. At first, it was subtle, just a slight scraping, like something dragging across the metal. It was almost soothing in its familiarity, like it had been there all along. But then, it changed. The scraping intensified, growing louder, closer, as if something was moving toward me, something unseen but undeniably real. My heart pounded in my chest, and I pressed myself against the elevator wall, trying to find some comfort in the cold, smooth metal. Sweat dripped down my brow despite the chill, and I could feel my legs shaking beneath me. The scraping had become frantic like an animal caught in a trap, desperate to escape. I tried to force my breath to slow, tried to focus on my surroundings, to ground myself in some reality. But it was impossible. The sound kept growing louder, sharper, until it felt like the elevator was being torn apart from the inside. And then, as if to answer my silent prayer for silence, it stopped. The sudden stillness was worse than the noise. It was the calm before the storm. I dared to breathe again, slowly, cautiously, like a deer trying to make itself invisible. But that wasn't what happened. I felt it before I saw it. A coldness, a deep, biting chill that swept through the air and settled into my bones. I could see my breath again, fogging in front of me, though the temperature hadn't changed much in the elevator. It wasn't just a drop in temperature. It was an unnatural coldness, a presence that crept into every inch of the space. And then the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then, with a sudden jolt, they went out completely. The pitch-black darkness was crushing. I had no sense of where I was, what was around me, what could be lurking just inches away. My mind raced, and I found myself taking shallow breaths, my fingers numb from clutching my phone, its dim flashlight a tiny beacon in the infinite blackness. I turned it on again, desperate to see something, anything. The weak beam illuminated only a fraction of the space, but it was enough. I saw them. There, in the far corner of the elevator, just outside the reach of the light, were shadows. But they weren't shadows like the ones I'd seen before. No, these were darker, moving, shifting like something alive. The edges blurred and rippled like ink in water. I blinked. Hard. I had to be imagining things. I couldn't be seeing this. It had to be the darkness playing tricks on me, messing with my mind. But when I looked again, they were still there. The shapes they were more than shadows now slowly began to emerge. They crawled across the floor, dragging their forms in unnatural ways, as though the laws of physics didn't apply to them. I could hear the faintest sound accompanying their movements, scraping, but not metal. It was something softer, more organic, like skin or bone dragging against the cold, unforgiving floor. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My hands trembled, the flashlight quivering in my grip. I tried to scream, to call for help, but the words died in my throat. There was no one. There was nothing. And then they started to move toward me. The figures, no, they were more than just shadows shambled forward, their movements jerky and disjointed, like they were struggling to control their limbs. Their forms were humanoid, but grotesque, contorted beyond any semblance of human nature. The edges of their bodies seemed to blur and stretch, as though they were not fully solid. I blinked again, but they were closer now, much closer. I could feel them moving through the air, their presence pressing down on me. My heart was racing so violently that I thought it might burst from my chest. Sweat soaked my skin, and I could feel the bile rise in my throat. One of them, a figure with hollow, sunken eyes, took a step closer. The air seemed to freeze, as though the world had suddenly stopped turning. I could hear nothing but the rapid beating of my heart and the slow, deliberate shuffling of their feet. It stopped directly in front of me. The flashlight flickered again, the beam just barely touching the figure's face. The skin was slick, gray, stretched thin over bone. Its eyes empty, dark, and soulless locked with mine, and I couldn't look away. It felt like the very essence of its gaze was seeping into me, suffocating me. My blood ran cold, and my entire body locked in place, unable to move, unable to scream. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure backed away, its grotesque form melting into the shadows. The others followed, retreating back into the dark corners of the elevator. The silence that followed was deafening. I wanted to move, to run, to do something, anything, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I was frozen in place, caught in a nightmarish trance, unable to tear my eyes away from the spot where the creature had stood. The light flickered one last time, casting long shadows that stretched across the walls like fingers reaching toward me. I had no idea what had just happened. Was it real? Was I losing my mind? The elevator remained eerily still, the shadows gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, still watching. And then, as if to answer my question, the elevator began to move. But this time, it wasn't the gentle motion I'd become accustomed to. No, it was as though the entire elevator was being dragged downward, pulling me with it, the walls shaking with unnatural force. The lights flickered again, and the floor beneath me vibrating as if the elevator was plunging deeper and deeper into something dark. It was as though the elevator wasn't moving through space. It was moving through time, through some place beyond human understanding. I gripped the edges of the elevator's control panel, trying desperately to steady myself as the floor tilted beneath me. The lights above buzzed and flickered violently as the elevator descended, its descent accelerating with every passing second. And that's when I saw it, the thing that would haunt me forever. The darkness that filled the elevator was not just empty space. It was alive. It had substance. It had weight. The sensation of the elevator dropping faster than I thought possible was unbearable. My stomach churned, twisting in knots, as though I was being sucked into an endless abyss. The lights flickered violently, casting fractured shadows that danced around me like distorted figures of nightmares. The walls groaned and creaked, and I felt the floor shift beneath my feet, as though the very foundation of the building itself was beginning to crumble. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't stay in this terrifying, unnatural place any longer. The strange figures, those twisted, inhuman shadows, had been real. They weren't some figment of my imagination. I wasn't just stuck in an elevator. I had been trapped in something far worse, a place that existed between worlds, between dimensions. And I could feel it, whatever had happened to me, whatever force had pulled me into this nightmare, it was far from over. I pressed my hand against the cold metal of the control panel, desperate to stop the descent. The elevator's emergency button had to be somewhere. Anything that might get me out of this. I fumbled with the panel, my fingers shaking uncontrollably. Every press of the button sent an electric pulse through my body, a sharp jolt that made my head spin. And then, for a moment, there was silence. The elevator had stopped. My ears rang with the silence, the absence of sound almost worse than the constant noise of the flickering lights and the elevator's groaning movement. I could still feel the weight of the air around me, thick and heavy, as though something was pressing against me, watching me. The darkness seemed to press in even harder now that the elevator had stopped. I dared not look, afraid of what I might see. I had to get out. Without thinking, I slammed my hand against the emergency hatch, the panel that would allow me to open the door. It wasn't easy. The hatch felt stuck, as though something was holding it in place, as though it didn't want me to leave. But desperation drove me forward. I gritted my teeth and pushed harder, using every ounce of my strength. The hatch finally gave way. A cold, suffocating gust of air rushed in as the door slid open, but it wasn't the fresh air of freedom I had been hoping for. No, it was an unnatural wind, thick and oppressive, like a fog that hadn't moved in years. I looked out into the darkness beyond the elevator doors, squinting against the oppressive shadows that stretched into the void. I could barely make out anything at all. The corridor in front of me was long and unlit, a yawning blackness that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls around me had taken on an eerie, distorted quality. The edges of the walls blurred, like the lines between reality and something else had started to melt away. I felt my heart hammer in my chest as I hesitated on the edge of the threshold. I had to keep moving. I stepped into the darkness, each step I took sending shivers down my spine. The air was thick, as though the very atmosphere was alive, holding me in place with an unseen force. The elevator doors slammed shut behind me, and I was left standing in the hallway, unsure of what to do, unsure of where to go. I didn't know if I was walking deeper into the nightmare or if I was finally leaving it behind. I just had to keep moving. I wasn't sure I had much left in me to fight whatever had trapped me in that elevator. My body felt heavy, my limbs like lead, but somehow I kept moving forward, step after step. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the hallway, an unnatural and amplified noise that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It felt like something was walking just behind me, moving in sync with every step I took. I dared not look behind me, afraid that if I did, I would see something that would drive me to madness. Minutes, or maybe hours later, I reached the end of the corridor. There was a door there, an exit of sorts. It looked normal, too plain for everything that had happened. I reached for the doorknob, and for the first time since I had been trapped, a small sliver of hope pierced through the fear. Maybe, just maybe, this was the way out. I opened the door. On the other side was another hallway. The same hallway. The same flickering lights. The same distorted walls that stretched into the blackness. It was as if I had never left the elevator at all, as if I had just entered another twisted version of the same place. Panic gripped me. I slammed the door shut, trying to steady my breath. I had to think. There had to be a way out of this. I wasn't going to let this place swallow me whole. But even as I turned to look back down the hallway, I knew the truth. There was no way out. Not the way I had come, and not the way I was trying to go. Whatever force had taken control of that elevator, whatever had trapped me in its depths, was still there, watching, waiting. I had only just begun to understand what had happened. The hallway, the elevator, the shadows, it was all part of something far bigger. A trap. A prison. I was never supposed to leave. And as I stood there, with nowhere to go and no answers to be found, I realized that my escape was an illusion. What I had been experiencing was not just an accident, it was deliberate. The elevator had been more than just a transport, it had been a door to something much darker, a threshold into a place where reality bent and twisted. My only choice was to keep walking, but I knew deep down that no matter how far I went, I'd never escape. Not really. Not without paying the price. And so I walked on, each step heavier than the last, as the shadows behind me reached out, just waiting for the right moment to consume me. I kept walking through the endless corridor, my footsteps echoing in the heavy silence, a stark reminder that I was no longer in control. The shadows that crept along the edges of the hallway seemed to twist and contort as I passed, stretching unnaturally, like they were reaching for me, trying to pull me into the abyss. Each step felt like I was walking further from any chance of salvation, and yet I couldn't stop. There was no turning back. As I moved forward, my mind raced. What had I stepped into? Was this some kind of alternate dimension? A nightmare I couldn't wake from? The once comforting thought of leaving the elevator, of escaping the metal box, now felt naive. In hindsight, it had been the start of my descent into something far worse. What was it about that place? Why did the walls seem alive? Why did it feel as if I had crossed over into a world where time and space had lost their meaning? The hallway stretched on and on, endlessly. The door I had passed through hadn't led to the exit I'd hoped for. It had been a loop. A constant cycle I couldn't break. Was I being punished for something? Or had I unknowingly walked into a trap set for anyone unfortunate enough to get stuck in that elevator? I tried to call out, but the sound of my own voice was swallowed by the oppressive air, as if the place itself didn't want to acknowledge my presence. Every breath I took seemed heavier than the last, filled with a metallic taste that lingered in my throat. Sweat beaded on my forehead, and my heart beat faster with every step. How long had I been walking? Hours? Days? I couldn't tell. The hallway never changed, never gave me a clue. The flickering lights remained constant, casting their unsettling shadows. The hum of the building was gone now, replaced by the eerie stillness. Even the air had grown stale, like it had been trapped here for ages, waiting for anyone to wander in and become another lost soul. Eventually, I reached another door. It was identical to the one I had opened before, and just like last time, a small spark of hope flared in my chest. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling, unsure of what I might find behind it. But the door swung open with an unexpected ease. Beyond it, I was confronted by a darkened space, another hallway. The same one. Over and over, I was led back to this twisted, unending loop, like a fly caught in a spider's web. There was no way out. There was no escape. I slammed the door shut, desperate, furious. What was this? Why was I trapped in this endless nightmare? My mind screamed, but my body had already begun to shut down. I was numb now, disconnected from any sense of reality. I couldn't keep going on like this. The weight of the situation hit me fully for the first time. I wasn't just stuck in an elevator. I wasn't just trapped in a building. This place, this hallway, was part of something much darker. Something ancient. I had wandered too far into a space where I wasn't meant to be. I'd crossed some invisible line, opened a door that should never have been touched. And now, there was no way back. I was here forever. The realization sent a cold shiver down my spine. I had become one of the lost ones. I had joined the ranks of those who had disappeared into this never-ending maze, swallowed up by the place that existed between worlds. It didn't matter how hard I tried to escape. It didn't matter how many times I opened doors that led to nothing. I would never leave. With no clear sense of direction anymore, I collapsed against the wall. I was exhausted physically, mentally, emotionally drained. My body ached from the endless walking, from the tension of never knowing what was waiting for me around the corner. But there was no corner, no end, no beginning. I could feel it now, the weight of the place pressing down on me. The walls, the shadows, they were alive, sentient, watching me, waiting. I wasn't alone. But even worse than the feeling of being watched was the realization that I had become just another part of the machinery that drove this endless cycle. I was no longer a person. I was just another lost soul trapped in the dark, another story to be forgotten. My eyes began to close, the weight of my own thoughts pulling me into a deep sleep I couldn't fight. I wasn't sure if I'd ever wake up from this place, or if I'd wake up to anything at all. As my mind drifted, I had one final thought, a fleeting whisper that danced on the edge of my consciousness. What if this place had always been here? What if I had walked into it without even realizing it? What if this corridor, this building, this twisted nightmare was just another layer of the world? A parallel reality where the rules of time and space didn't apply. But it didn't matter. None of it mattered anymore. There was no escape, no resolution. Only darkness. Only this place. And eventually, just like me, they'd stop trying. It all began one bright Saturday morning, the kind that promised nothing but peace and serenity. I had just finished a long stretch of work and needed to clear my head. So I decided to head out into the woods for a solo hike, something I had done countless times before. I knew the area well enough, a small forest preserve just a few miles outside town, where the trails were peaceful and the sounds of nature were more than enough to drown out the usual stresses of life. I wasn't alone in this endeavor, though. I had invited my friend Ben along, someone who loved hiking as much as I did. He was always up for an adventure, and I knew he'd enjoy the day away from the bustle of everyday life. Ben was a tall guy, with a lean build and the kind of easygoing nature that made him the perfect hiking companion. We had done this countless times, just two guys, backpacks filled with essentials, trekking through the woods without a care in the world. The plan was simple, a few hours of hiking in the morning, followed by a stop at a small clearing by the stream for lunch. Afterward, we'd take the longer, less traveled path back to the entrance and call it a day. The sun was shining brightly as we began our trek, and everything felt as it should, calm, tranquil, and normal. I packed my bag with all the necessities: water, snacks, a map of the trails, and a small first aid kit. Ben had the same, though his pack seemed a bit heavier, likely because he brought along his camera, always eager to capture moments in nature. We were both experienced hikers. We knew what we were doing. We had been on many hikes together, navigating the same familiar trails. Nothing about today seemed out of the ordinary, or so I thought. As we started walking, the usual sounds of birds chirping, leaves rustling in the wind, and the soft crunch of dirt beneath our boots created a soothing rhythm. There were moments of silence as we moved along, each of us lost in our own thoughts, but perfectly content in the shared solitude. The world outside the woods seemed far away, and for a moment it felt like there was nothing else that mattered. The path we were on was narrow, flanked by tall trees on either side, their trunks thick and gnarled. Every now and then, I'd glance over at Ben, who was scanning the surroundings with the same quiet appreciation that I shared. We were comfortable here in our own little world, where time didn't seem to rush, and the concerns of life were nothing but a distant memory. The first hour passed quickly, and we reached our destination, a small clearing near the stream where we would take a short break. The sound of water flowing over rocks was soothing, and the area was peaceful, untouched by the noise of civilization. We sat down on a couple of rocks near the water's edge, pulled out our snacks, and chatted about nothing in particular, just the usual back and forth that filled the empty spaces between thoughts. But there was something strange in the air that I couldn't quite place. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable at first. It wasn't the kind of feeling that would set off any alarms, but more like a nagging thought at the back of my mind. It wasn't just the silence around us, though it was unusually quiet. Even the birds, which had been so loud earlier, seemed to have quieted down. There was a stillness in the air that didn't sit right with me, but I brushed it off. Nature, after all, can be unpredictable. Ben didn't seem to notice anything unusual. He was busy fiddling with his camera, trying to get the perfect shot of the stream and the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. I watched him for a moment before standing up and stretching my legs. I needed to shake off the odd sensation I'd been feeling. Maybe it was just the isolation or the fact that we had been walking for hours without any real break. But whatever it was, I couldn't shake it. We packed up our things and decided to continue our hike, aiming to take the longer path back to the entrance. The air was cooler now, and the sun had started to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the trail. Everything felt fine at first, just like it always had during our previous hikes. Yet, there was something different now, an unsettling undercurrent that I couldn't quite shake. It was as if the woods had shifted around us, and the familiar had turned slightly foreign. The trail ahead appeared to be untouched, with no signs of other hikers. The path was narrow, the trees growing even thicker around us, as though the woods were slowly swallowing the trail whole. We kept walking, chatting occasionally, but the atmosphere felt off, too still, too quiet. The trail twisted and turned, following the natural contours of the land, but something didn't sit right. The feeling was growing stronger now, and I could sense Ben beginning to pick up on it too. But it wasn't until we reached the next bend that things began to truly shift. As we rounded the corner, something caught my eye, something strange and out of place. It was a small object lying in the middle of the trail. I couldn't make it out from where I stood, but it was definitely not something I'd seen before. I stopped in my tracks, and Ben, noticing my hesitation, turned to look at what I was staring at. "Is that a shoe?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ben walked over and picked it up. It was a hiking boot, but it was old, caked in mud, and definitely not one that belonged to either of us. It didn't make sense. We hadn't seen anyone else on the trail, and the shoe was too out of place, too abandoned to ignore. Ben shrugged it off, tossing it aside as he continued walking. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling it stirred in me. There was something about that shoe that didn't sit right, something I couldn't put into words. But there was more to it than just a lost shoe. We kept moving forward, though the feeling of being watched hung in the air, thick and unrelenting. It was at that moment that I realized, deep down, this wasn't just any normal hike. Something was out there. Something I wasn't ready to understand. And as the woods grew darker and the shadows stretched longer, I couldn't help but feel that we had crossed into a place where the ordinary no longer applied. We were no longer just two friends out for a peaceful hike. We were now part of something much bigger, something far more unsettling. And the woods, they were changing. As we continued along the trail, the woods around us seemed to grow thicker, the trees closing in as though pushing us further into the unknown. The sun had now dipped low enough that the shadows stretched across the path like fingers, reaching for our ankles, making everything appear slightly distorted, as if the forest itself were warping around us. It wasn't just the trail that had changed, though. The air itself had a density to it, a heaviness that wasn't there before. My breath felt a little more labored, my steps a little slower. I glanced over at Ben, who seemed just as unaffected as he always was. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. There was an odd tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. We had been walking for about an hour after we left the clearing by the stream, and we still hadn't encountered another soul. This wasn't entirely unusual, since this particular path wasn't as popular as some of the others, but the silence had a thickness to it, one that I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't the usual hum of the forest. The chirping of birds had ceased, and even the rustling of leaves had quieted, replaced only by the soft crunch of our boots on the dirt. "Man, it's getting kind of weird out here," I said, trying to break the silence. Ben, who had been focused on his camera again, looked up. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. It's just too quiet, don't you think?" He laughed, the sound almost too loud in the stillness of the woods. "You're starting to sound like one of those horror movie guys. You've been watching too many scary films." I didn't find it funny. "No, I'm serious. I mean, even the wind's not blowing. Doesn't it feel off to you?" Ben shrugged, though I could see a flicker of something, whether it was unease or curiosity, cross his face. He adjusted the strap of his camera bag, as though preparing for another round of photos. "Maybe you're just tired. It's been a long hike. We can take a break soon." But as we continued walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. It wasn't the kind of thing that would make your skin crawl or force you to stop in your tracks. It was more of an inkling, a vague sense that something was lurking just beyond the edge of my perception. We walked in silence for a while after that, the sound of our boots crunching through the dry underbrush, the only thing breaking the oppressive quiet. I wanted to tell Ben how I felt, how everything seemed different, even if I couldn't quite put it into words, but I didn't. He was too wrapped up in his photography, and honestly, I didn't want to sound paranoid. It was then that we noticed something. It wasn't a loud noise or a dramatic event. It was subtle, something easily overlooked if you weren't paying attention. But I noticed it, and so did Ben, because we both stopped in our tracks at the same time. A twig, a single twig, lying perfectly across the path, just a few feet ahead of us. Now, this might not sound like much. A broken branch here, or there is a common occurrence in the woods. But this twig wasn't like the others. It was too deliberately placed. Too precise. I stared at it for a moment, and Ben did the same. It wasn't a natural occurrence, like something that had fallen from a tree due to the wind. No, it was almost as though someone had placed it there, positioned it so that we would notice it. I took a cautious step forward and kicked it aside, my heart rate quickening for reasons I couldn't quite explain. It was just a twig, right? But the moment my foot touched it, I felt an odd chill run up my spine, as though I had disturbed something that shouldn't have been touched. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice low. Ben, still holding his camera, was staring intently at the ground. "What? A twig?" "Yeah. It's weird, right? It's just placed there." Ben rolled his eyes, but there was a hesitation in his step as he continued forward. "It's just a twig, man. Let's keep moving. The sooner we get out of here, the sooner we can get back to the car." I nodded, but my mind wasn't as easily distracted. Something wasn't right, and that twig had been the first real sign that I wasn't just imagining things. It was small, almost insignificant, but in the silence of the woods, it was impossible to ignore. We walked on, but the air seemed even heavier now, and the woods felt denser. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches almost reaching toward us, like they were closing us in. I tried to brush the feeling aside. I couldn't let myself get too worked up over something so small. But with every step, it felt as if the woods were changing, shifting into something less familiar. Then it happened again. This time, it was harder to ignore. Ahead of us, just barely visible through the trees, I spotted something unusual. It was a shape, a dark figure, standing still in the middle of the path. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by one of the trees. But as we approached, I saw it more clearly. It was a human figure, standing completely still, facing away from us. My heart skipped a beat. "Ben, do you see that?" I whispered, even though I wasn't sure I wanted him to. Ben squinted ahead, then shook his head. "It's probably just another hiker. We should keep going." But I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled deep in my stomach. This was no ordinary hiker. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge our presence. It was like it was frozen in place, standing motionless, as if it had been waiting for us. I took a step forward, cautiously, and then another. Ben, sensing my discomfort, followed me, albeit more reluctantly. "Hey," I called out. "You okay?" There was no response. I was close now, within a few feet of the figure. And that's when I saw it, the thing that made my blood run cold. The figure's clothes were torn and filthy, like it had been out here for days, maybe even weeks. Its hair was matted, hanging in long, tangled strands. But the most disturbing thing was its face, or rather, the lack of one. Where a face should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless expanse of skin, pale and glistening, almost unnatural in the dim light. I froze, and Ben did too. "Okay, Now I'm freaked out, Ben muttered under his breath. Before I could respond, the figure shifted. Not in a normal way. It jerked, like something that wasn't quite alive, and then it took a slow, deliberate step toward us. And that's when we bolted. We didn't need to say anything. The sudden rush of adrenaline was all the communication we needed. We ran without looking back, the sound of our footsteps crashing through the underbrush, the figure's silent presence still haunting the air behind us. We didn't stop until we reached the main trail again, panting, hearts racing. Neither of us spoke for a long time, both of us too afraid to break the silence, as if doing so would somehow invite the figure back into our world. But one thing was certain, the woods had changed. Something was wrong, and we had no idea what we had just encountered. All we knew was that it wasn't something we were meant to see. The air had grown heavier, thick with an almost palpable tension, as if the very woods around us were holding their breath. The trees towered above us like silent sentinels, their bare branches twisting and creaking in the windless expanse. It was late afternoon now, and the light filtering through the canopy above had taken on an unnatural, sickly wave, dull and faded, as if the sun had given up on warming the world beneath it. We were no longer talking, no longer joking about the oddity of the situation. The unease that had settled between us was too thick for words. Ben, who had been the more skeptical of the two of us, was now walking with a noticeable tension in his posture, his camera still clutched tightly in his hand, though he hadn't taken a single picture in hours. I couldn't even bring myself to look at him. My focus was entirely on the path ahead of us, my eyes scanning every shadow, every rustling bush, every movement in the periphery of my vision. After what had happened with the figure, neither of us had dared to go back the way we came. We'd found another path that seemed to lead deeper into the woods, but there was no relief in that. The quiet, oppressive stillness of the forest only seemed to grow thicker the further we ventured. Every now and then, I would hear the snap of a twig behind us, or the whisper of a breeze where no wind existed. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. No figure, no movement, only the woods themselves vast, empty, and far too silent. I glanced over at Ben, who was looking intently at the ground as he walked, his brow furrowed. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice hoarse from the tension that had been building all day. Ben didn't answer right away. His footsteps faltered for a second before he continued walking, his eyes still on the dirt path. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, almost as though he was afraid to disturb the stillness of the woods. "I think we're being followed." The words hung in the air between us, and I felt the blood drain from my face. My stomach churned with dread as I scanned the trees, half expecting to see the pale figure from earlier lurking just out of sight. But there was nothing. Only the trees. Only the forest. I forced myself to take a breath, trying to calm the rush of panic that was surging through me. "Ben, we need to keep moving. We're already lost. We can't afford to panic now." He nodded slowly, but I could see the doubt in his eyes, the same fear that was settling in my chest. We didn't talk much after that. We just kept walking, the only sound being the crunch of our boots against the dry leaves and the occasional rustling of the trees around us. Every now and then, we would hear something footsteps or the faintest sound of something brushing against the leaves. But when we turned to look, it was always just the wind or a shifting branch. But then, the strangest thing happened. It was so subtle that I almost missed it, but something caught my attention out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but then I heard it, a faint thud, like something heavy hitting the ground, followed by a quick rustling sound. I stopped dead in my tracks and turned toward the noise, straining to see through the trees. Ben stopped too, his head whipping around to face me. His expression was one of concern, but I could see that he was also looking for an explanation. "What was that?" he asked, his voice tight with tension. "I don't know," I replied, my throat dry. "I thought I heard something, like something falling." We stood there for a moment, the silence around us deepening. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in, something that I couldn't see, but I could feel it just on the edge of my awareness, like a shadow that was always just behind me. "Let's check it out," Ben said, his voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, but only for a second. The woods were starting to feel like a maze now, each turn and fork in the path leading to nowhere. We were in too deep to just turn around, and the strange noises were getting to me. The need to understand, to make sense of the creeping fear, was overwhelming. We pushed through the thick underbrush, our bodies brushing against the spindly branches that seemed to reach out to grab us. The trees were denser here, their trunks twisting like gnarled fingers, and the shadows had grown longer, deeper. Every movement, every rustle, felt like it was being watched. As we moved forward, the air grew colder, the ground damp beneath our boots. The strange feeling of being followed hadn't left me, and now it felt like the very woods themselves were closing in on us. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, a loud thrum of fear, but I forced myself to keep moving, to keep pushing forward. Then, we found it. Lying on the ground, just off the path, was a torn piece of cloth, dark and tattered, as though it had been dragged across the forest floor for days. It was the same strange color as the figure we had seen earlier, and it sent a chill crawling up my spine. Ben crouched down beside it, his fingers hesitating just above the fabric, but he didn't touch it. He looked up at me, his face pale. "I don't like this, man," he muttered. This is wrong." I felt the same, but I didn't want to say it out loud. We stood there for a moment, just staring at the cloth, when I heard it again. This time, it was closer, too close. A snap, a sharp crack from behind us. I whirled around, my heart racing. Ben was already backing up, his camera hanging loosely at his side. We both scanned the trees, our breaths coming out in shallow gasps, but there was nothing. Nothing but the deepening shadows and the oppressive silence. We moved faster now, almost running, our feet stumbling over the uneven ground as we tried to put as much distance between us and whatever was out there. The forest seemed to grow even darker with every step, the trees blocking out more and more of the fading light. And then, just as we thought we had outrun whatever was following us, we heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind us, too quick, too deliberate. Ben grabbed my arm. "We need to go. Now." Without another word, we turned and ran, not knowing where the path was taking us, only knowing that we had to get away. The footsteps echoed behind us, matching our pace, always just a few steps behind. And all the while, the trees whispered, the branches shaking, and the ground seemed to pulse beneath our feet, as if the very forest itself was alive, watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. But we couldn't stop. Not until we were out of the woods, out of whatever had followed us in, out of whatever was trying to claim us as its own. The pace of our flight slowed to a panicked shuffle as the woods seemed to close in around us. I couldn't even remember when we stopped running, when we transitioned from frantic escape to stumbling exhaustion. It was as if the very air had conspired against us, draining our strength, slowing our movements, and forcing us to confront the reality of our situation. We were lost. The path, which had seemed so promising just hours before, was now a mere fragment of a memory, swallowed up by the oppressive expanse of trees. Every direction looked the same, every shadow felt unfamiliar. The haunting sound of footsteps, still too close, still too deliberate, echoed through the woods, driving my pulse into overdrive. The more I tried to shake the feeling of being followed, the more it intensified. It wasn't just behind us now. It was everywhere, filling the air, lurking at the edges of our vision, in every crack and crevice of the forest. "Ben," I gasped, my voice trembling, barely audible. "Where do we go? What do we do?" He was ahead of me, but even in the dim light, I could see the tight set of his shoulders, the way his hands shook as he gripped his camera. His breathing was shallow, panicked. For the first time, I saw the fear in his eyes, fear that was as raw and uncontrollable as my own. "We can't go back," he replied, his voice strained. "There's nowhere to go." I nodded, understanding the weight of his words. It had been hours since we had stumbled upon that torn piece of fabric, the only tangible clue that something was wrong, something far beyond the realm of the normal. The figure we had seen earlier, the whispers in the air, the unsettling sense of being watched, it all felt like a jigsaw puzzle we couldn't put together. No matter how many times we turned, no matter how many paths we took, it was as though we were only getting deeper into the heart of whatever was haunting this place. Then, as if on cue, the forest around us shifted. The wind stopped abruptly, and the temperature dropped. A bone-chilling cold seeped through my clothes, biting at my skin, and the trees, which had once seemed so static, now felt alive. Their trunks seemed to stretch upward unnaturally, their branches groaning under the weight of an unseen force. The air, thick and heavy, hung like a dark veil over us. "Ben." My voice cracked as I looked around, searching for some sign of where we were, some way out. But the landscape was alien, distorted. The forest felt wrong. Without warning, the ground beneath us trembled. It was subtle at first, a low vibration that buzzed through the soles of my boots, but it grew, rising in intensity until the earth seemed to shake with an unnatural fury. My heart lurched in my chest. I grabbed Ben's arm, and he spun to face me, his face pale with terror. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the growing rumble. Before I could respond, the trees began to sway, bending and twisting as though they were being pulled by some unseen force. The branches reached out like long fingers, their tips scraping against the air with a sound that sent shivers down my spine. I took a step back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But the more I looked, the more distorted everything became. The trees, the forest, the entire world around us seemed to be warping, like a nightmarish reflection in a cracked mirror. Then it happened. A low, guttural sound emanated from the heart of the woods. It was a roar, no, a growl, deep and primal, as though the very earth itself was speaking. I froze, unable to move, my body frozen in terror. I felt it, that deep, primal instinct that told me something was coming, a force that was ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting for us. The air crackled with static, as if the very atmosphere was charged with electricity. And then, out of the shadows, it appeared. At first, it was only a blur, a shift in the darkness that moved with unnatural speed, but then it solidified. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, wide-eyed, at the creature that emerged from the trees. It was taller than any man, its silhouette towering above us like a grotesque figure from some forgotten myth. The skin, or what appeared to be skin, was a sickly shade of gray, stretched tight over its skeletal frame. Its limbs were impossibly long, its joints bent at awkward angles, as though it were not meant to move in the way it did. But what truly struck me was its face. It was a mask of grotesque features, a face that shouldn't exist in nature. Hollow eyes stared at us with an intensity that made my blood run cold. The mouth was a twisted, jagged grin, lips pulled back to reveal rows of sharp, uneven teeth. And though it had no voice, I felt its presence in my bones, a force so chilling, so inhuman, that it seemed to reach into my very soul. Ben gasped, his knees buckling beneath him. I felt the same weight, the same suffocating dread, pressing down on me, but I couldn't look away. It was as if some unseen force held me captive, forcing me to watch as the creature, no, the thing moved toward us. We didn't move. We couldn't. It stopped just a few feet away, its form looming over us. And for a moment, the world stood still. The growling sound that had filled the air before had stopped. The trees no longer swayed. The wind had died completely, and the only sound left was the pounding of my own heart, a frantic rhythm that filled my ears. The creature, if that's what it was, tilted its head, its hollow eyes never leaving mine. I could feel its gaze, cold and calculating, as though it was studying us, weighing us, deciding what to do next. It wasn't like anything I had ever seen, and yet it felt so familiar, like it had always been here, lurking in the depths of the woods, waiting for us to stumble into its territory. It felt like hours, though I knew it could have only been a few minutes. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned away. Its movements were fluid, unnatural, and it melted back into the shadows of the trees, disappearing as quickly as it had come. I blinked, trying to comprehend what I had just seen. My hands were shaking, my legs unsteady beneath me. Ben was on the ground, his face ashen, his body trembling in shock. The world around us felt distorted, unreal, and I didn't know if what I had witnessed had been real or some twisted nightmare. But deep down, I knew it had been real. I could feel it in my bones, in the air around me. Ben's voice broke the silence, barely a whisper. Did that just happen? I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was too stunned, too terrified to form words. I could only nod, my throat tight, my mind racing. But then, from the darkness, came a sound that was impossible to ignore. The growl. It was closer this time. It was coming for us. The silence that followed the creature's departure was deafening. I felt the air weigh heavily around me, pressing down on my chest like a tangible force, as if it were closing in, suffocating me with the weight of the unknown. Ben's breath was shallow, ragged, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if it was my own panic making my pulse race or if his fear was infecting mine. We didn't speak, not right away. Words seemed so useless in the face of what we'd just encountered. We were standing in the middle of a vast, empty forest, trapped by a creature a thing that defied all logic, all understanding. It was beyond our comprehension, beyond our ability to process. I looked at Ben. His face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. He didn't even seem to know what to do, or where to go, or even if we could get out. For the first time, I realized that we might not. The world around us was no longer the forest I knew, the place I had walked through countless times. It was a place that had become twisted, alien, as though it had shifted into something else entirely, something beyond the realm of human experience. Ben, I whispered, though my voice barely escaped. We need to get out of here. Now. He nodded, though it was clear he wasn't sure where we could go. The trees had stopped moving, but the air still felt electric, as though it had been charged with an unseen force. It was oppressive, like the forest itself was watching, waiting. And that creature, whatever it was still somewhere out there, hidden in the shadows, perhaps just out of sight. Its presence a constant weight on our minds. We moved slowly, cautiously, trying to avoid making noise. The last thing we needed was to draw attention to ourselves. Every snap of a twig beneath our feet, every rustle of leaves in the distance, made my heart race in fear that it was the creature returning. We walked in silence, each step an exercise in trying to regain some sense of control, some semblance of normalcy. But the further we moved, the more I realized that nothing was the same. The path I had once known, easy to follow, winding through familiar trees, was gone. The forest had shifted around us, twisted into something unrecognizable. Every direction felt wrong, as if we were being herded into some unseen corner, trapped in the very place we had been trying to escape. How is this possible? Ben muttered under his breath, his words laced with frustration and fear. This doesn't make sense. We were just on the trail. How could everything change like this? I didn't have an answer. I didn't even know if I wanted one. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like whatever had happened in these woods was far beyond anything we could explain. The creature, the thing that had stalked us, was only the surface of something deeper, something darker. And now, we were part of that something, trapped in a nightmare of our own making. Suddenly, I stopped in my tracks. A faint light flickered in the distance, just beyond the trees. It was barely perceptible at first, but as I focused, it grew brighter, stronger. I wasn't sure if it was a trick of the mind, some desperate hope that had manifested in my tired, terrified brain, but it felt real. A source of light in the oppressive darkness of the woods. Ben, I said, my voice cracking with urgency. Do you see that? Ben turned to follow my gaze, his eyes narrowing as he tried to focus on the distant glow. At first, he looked uncertain, then a flicker of hope crossed his face. Yeah, I see it. Without speaking, we both started moving toward it, driven by the instinct to escape, to find a way out. Every step felt like it could be our last. but the light was a beacon, a sign that maybe we weren't entirely lost, that there was still hope for us to survive whatever had ensnared us in this place. As we moved closer, the light grew more distinct, and I could make out a figure standing near its source. A person, someone who seemed to be waiting for us. My heart leapt in my chest. Could this be someone who could help us? Someone who had been in these woods longer, someone who knew the way out? But as we approached, I saw the person's face, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't a person at all. The figure was hooded, shrouded in darkness, and its face was covered in a featureless mask. No eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, expressionless surface that seemed to reflect the light in unnatural ways. It was like staring into a void, a black hole that sucked all warmth, all hope from the world around it. I stopped dead in my tracks, Ben doing the same beside me. Our eyes locked, both of us trying to process what we were seeing, unable to move, unable to scream. My pulse thudded in my ears as the figure stood there, motionless, watching us. And then it spoke. Not in words, not in a voice, but in a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the ground, through my chest, through every fiber of my being. It was a sound that felt ancient, as if the figure itself was older than the woods, older than time. Without thinking, I grabbed Ben's arm and yanked him back. We turned and ran, faster than we had ever run before. The woods, once disorienting, now felt like a maze that had opened up around us, a twisting path that led us farther from whatever nightmare had been waiting. My breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, and my legs burned from the exertion, but we didn't stop. We couldn't. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure chasing us, but the woods were empty, silent, still. We didn't stop running until we broke through the trees and stumbled out into the open field. The air felt different here, fresher, lighter. I looked around, my eyes scanning the horizon, searching for any sign of the creature or the masked figure. But there was nothing. We were free. Or at least, I thought we were. The silence was overwhelming. The woods behind us, dark and oppressive, seemed to mock our escape. We were back in the world, yes, but the world didn't feel like it had been before. It had shifted, like the forest, like the air, like the ground beneath our feet. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever we had encountered in those woods was not over. It hadn't ended. It had only just begun. Ben and I sat down on the edge of the field, both of us too tired to speak, too scared to say what we were both thinking. The woods, the creature, the figure, none of it made sense, but I knew one thing for sure. We had seen something that was not supposed to exist. And as much as I wanted to leave it behind, as much as I wanted to forget, I couldn't. It was in my mind, in my bones, and I knew that it would never truly be over. Not yet. The days that followed were a blur, a haze of unease and questions that no one could answer. Ben and I made our way back to civilization, but the feeling of something chasing us, following us, never quite left. The forest that had been so familiar to me, the place I had known my entire life, now seemed like a distant memory, a place that belonged to another version of reality, one I was no longer sure I understood. We tried to tell people what happened, tried to explain the things we saw, the creature, the figure, the overwhelming sense of wrongness that had consumed us. But no one believed us. People tried to reassure us, to convince us that it was just our minds playing tricks, that we were exhausted, that we had imagined it all. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen. I knew what had chased us through those woods. And I knew that it wasn't done. I didn't know why, but the knowledge haunted me every day. There were times when I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, feeling as though I was still running, still being hunted by something that I couldn't explain. Sometimes I would hear that strange hum in the distance, deep in my chest, vibrating through the air, and I would freeze in place, unsure if I was hearing things or if it was real. Ben tried to convince me to move on, to leave it all behind. "It's over," he would say. "We're out. We're safe." But the look in his eyes told a different story. He knew too. We both knew that we had narrowly escaped something far darker than we could ever imagine. The nightmares began not long after, vivid and unnerving. I would find myself back in those woods, running, always running. The trees towered over me, twisting and bending, their branches reaching for me like long, gnarled fingers. And then I would hear it, the hum. That deep, resonant sound, vibrating through the air, vibrating through my very soul. I would wake up, my heart pounding, my body drenched in cold sweat, only to find myself staring into the same empty darkness I had tried to escape. I never returned to those woods, not even once. As the months passed, life slowly crept back to normal, but the shadows never truly left. I would look at the trees, at the familiar paths that I once hiked, and feel a knot form in my stomach. I didn't go near the forest anymore, and neither did Ben. We both kept our distance, though we couldn't escape the lingering effects of what we'd experienced. I still don't know what it was that we encountered out there in those twisted woods. I don't know what that creature was, or what that figure was waiting for us. Some nights, I lie awake and wonder if it was some kind of test, some ancient presence, a force that had been waiting for someone, anyone, to stumble upon it. And yet, as much as I want to forget, as much as I want to believe that it was just a nightmare or a figment of my imagination, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there. That it's still watching, waiting for the next person foolish enough to wander too deep into its domain. There are stories about places like these, places that hold secrets darker than any we could imagine. Places where reality bends, where time warps, where creatures from beyond the edge of human understanding roam freely, hidden from the world we know. Maybe we were just unlucky enough to stumble upon one of those places. Maybe we were meant to walk away with only a warning. Some things are best left undisturbed. But as I sit here, years later, writing this, I can't help but wonder how many other people have walked those same paths. How many others have heard the hum, seen the shadows shift, and run, only to find themselves marked forever by whatever it was that watched us. Some stories stay with you. Some experiences are not meant to be forgotten. And I don't think I'll ever forget the way those woods felt, the way the air shifted when the creature emerged from the trees. I don't think I'll ever forget the sound, that hum that vibrated through my body, that marked me in ways I can't explain. I don't know if it's still out there, if it's still waiting, but I know one thing for sure: it hasn't forgotten me, and I haven't forgotten it. As I finish writing this, I can't help but glance toward the dark window, half expecting to see the familiar trees in the distance, their twisted branches reaching out toward me. I don't know if it's my mind playing tricks on me again, but I swear I hear something faint, distant, but undeniable. A hum. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just my mind, still haunted by what I saw. Or maybe, just maybe, it's the thing that still watches. Either way, I don't think I'll ever go near those woods again. But if you do, be careful. There are things in those woods that aren't meant to be seen. And once you've seen them, there's no going back. It all started like any other hiking trip. I was no stranger to the woods growing up in a small town near the mountains. Nature was practically in my blood. I had spent countless hours exploring the vast forest surrounding my home, always with a group of friends or a trusted companion. But this time, it was different. I went alone. It wasn't like I'd never hiked by myself before, but this particular forest, the Shadewood, had a reputation. The local folklore was filled with stories about people who ventured too deep into the woods and never returned, or those who came back changed, their minds broken. I had heard the stories all my life, but I was an adventurer at heart. I couldn't help but be drawn to the allure of the unknown. That morning, I had packed light, just a small backpack with water, a map, some snacks, and my camera to capture the stunning scenery. It was a sunny Saturday, and I had the whole day free. I figured I could spend a few hours walking the trails, maybe get a few good shots of the landscape, and then head back home. The hike was supposed to be a simple, relaxing outing. As I made my way through the forest, I couldn't help but feel at ease. The sun filtered through the canopy of trees, casting a soft glow on the ground beneath me. The air smelled fresh and earthy, and the quiet rustling of leaves in the wind was soothing. For a while, everything felt normal, even peaceful. The trail was well marked at first, with signs indicating the distance to various landmarks, but as I ventured deeper, I noticed the signs becoming sparse. The trail began to fade, and the forest seemed to grow denser, more ominous. Yet, I pressed on, excited by the challenge, confident in my ability to navigate the woods. It was then that I encountered something strange. The further I walked, the more the environment began to change. The trees around me grew thicker, their trunks twisted in unnatural shapes, and the air felt heavier, as if it was pressing down on me. I had always loved the woods, but now, for the first time, I felt a strange unease creeping up my spine. I pushed the feeling aside, telling myself it was just my imagination. It wasn't until I came across the old stone marker that my discomfort turned into genuine confusion. The stone was large and weathered, covered in moss and vines, with no visible inscription or markings. It stood there in the middle of the path, as if it had been placed deliberately. I didn't remember it from the last time I hiked this way, and I was fairly certain it wasn't on the map either. My curiosity got the better of me, and I took out my phone to snap a picture of it, as if that would somehow explain its presence. Little did I know, this moment would be the beginning of something far more unsettling than I could have ever imagined. I could still remember the feeling I had as I stood there, staring at that stone. Something was off, something was wrong. But at the time, I couldn't quite put my finger on it. As I continued on, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. But I shrugged it off as nerves. After all, I was in the woods alone for the first time in ages, so it was understandable to feel a little on edge. I had hiked plenty of isolated trails, but none of them had felt like this one. Despite the growing unease, I pressed forward. The path twisted and turned, and the woods seemed to close in around me. The further I went, the more the landscape shifted. Trees that once stood tall and majestic now looked gnarled and twisted. It was as if the forest was slowly transforming into something else entirely. But it wasn't just the environment that was changing. I began to hear things strange, soft noises that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But as I listened more closely, I realized that these sounds didn't match the usual forest sounds. It was as if someone or something was moving just out of sight. Despite the growing tension, I told myself I was overthinking things. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I looked at my watch. It was nearly noon. I figured I should probably start heading back soon, but as I turned to retrace my steps, something strange happened. The trail was gone. The familiar markers and signs I had relied on were nowhere to be found. The dense trees blocked out most of the light, and the path ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, leading me into a deeper and darker part of the woods. I tried to stay calm, pulling out the map from my backpack, but no matter how I looked at it, nothing made sense. The paths I had followed earlier didn't appear to exist anymore. Panic started to settle in. I retraced my steps, hoping to find the marker or a sign, but everything around me seemed unfamiliar. I was lost, completely, utterly lost. And the more I walked, the more the forest felt like it was closing in on me. I tried to take deep breaths to steady myself, but my heart was racing and my mind was starting to spiral. I knew I had to stay calm, but the more I tried to think rationally, the more the unease crept into my thoughts. Every step felt wrong, like I was walking into a place I shouldn't be. The quiet had become oppressive, and the forest had grown eerily still. It felt as if the woods themselves were watching me, waiting. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving just out of sight. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I kept walking, hoping to find something familiar, but it felt like I was getting nowhere. My mind raced with thoughts of the stories I had heard growing up, the ones about people who had vanished in these woods, never to be seen again. I had always dismissed them as local legends, but now, as I wandered through the dense forest, I couldn't help but wonder if there was some truth to them. As the minutes turned into hours, I began to realize the gravity of my situation. The forest, which at once seemed like a serene escape, now felt like an endless maze. I had stopped looking at the map. It seemed pointless now. The trees had become more oppressive, their trunks too thick, their branches interwoven so tightly that only the faintest slivers of sunlight reached the forest floor. The path, or what was supposed to be the path, had disappeared entirely, and now all I could do was push forward, hoping to stumble upon anything that would guide me out of this place. I hadn't seen another soul for hours. The silence around me was deafening, and with each step, I couldn't help but feel like the forest was growing more and more unfamiliar. It wasn't just the scenery that had changed. It was something deeper, something that tugged at the edges of my mind. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart skip a beat. The idea that I was being watched was no longer just a passing thought. It felt real now, heavy, pressing in from all sides. Then, as I stepped over a small stream, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow that didn't belong, a patch of dark green that seemed to shimmer unnaturally. But when I looked closer, I saw it was something far more unsettling. There, on the ground near the water's edge, was a perfectly folded piece of cloth, as if it had been placed deliberately. It wasn't a natural part of the environment. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd find lying in the woods, no discarded shirt or rag that might have blown there by accident. This piece of cloth was pristine, almost as if it had been waiting for someone to find it. I bent down to examine it, my fingers grazing the fabric. It was soft to the touch, but there was something about it that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The fabric was too clean, too out of place in the middle of the woods. My first instinct was to turn and walk away, to ignore it and keep moving. But something about it intrigued me. I unfolded the cloth slowly, hesitant to see what lay beneath. When I saw it, my heart nearly stopped. It was a small, worn photograph, faded and crinkled from years of exposure to the elements, but still visible enough for me to make out the image. It was a photo of a man standing in front of a cabin, a place I didn't recognize. His face was blurry, as if the picture had been taken too hastily, but there was something about his eyes, something about the way he was looking directly into the camera that made me uneasy. The way his gaze seemed to pierce through me sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just a casual photo. It felt like a message, like the man was trying to tell me something, even though he was long gone. I stood there for a moment, staring at the photo in my hand, trying to process what I had just found. It felt wrong. I had no idea how it had ended up here, in the middle of the woods, far from any recognizable trail. And yet, something about the image seemed to beckon me, pulling me deeper into the forest. I had to admit, I was starting to feel the weight of something more than just being lost. It wasn't just the isolation. It wasn't just the strange landscape or the eerie quiet. There was something else, a presence that had begun to creep into the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I had been so sure of myself earlier, so confident that I could handle whatever this forest threw at me. But now, with that photograph in my hand, the confidence was gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. I didn't know what to do with the photo. Part of me wanted to throw it away, to discard it and continue my search for a way out. But the other part of me, curious, foolish, kept it. I shoved the photo into my pocket, thinking it might somehow hold the key to getting out of this place. That was my first mistake. I continued walking, my steps slower now, more cautious. The woods around me felt different, as though they had taken on a life of their own. Every noise seemed amplified, every rustle of leaves a threat. I kept my eyes on the ground, my focus fixed on the trail, or what I hoped was the trail, desperately trying to find a way to reorient myself. Then I heard something. It wasn't a sound I could easily describe. It wasn't a bird call or the rustle of an animal in the underbrush. It was more like a shuffle, a dragging sound, soft, deliberate. It came from behind me. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. I slowly turned around, expecting to see another hiker, someone who had perhaps gotten lost as well. but there was nothing. No person, no animal. Just the trees silent, still, as if nothing had ever moved at all. I shook my head, trying to brush off the sensation. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, I thought. The isolation, the growing tension, it was all getting to me. I turned back to the path and kept walking, but the feeling lingered. That odd shuffle, that soft dragging sound, followed me. It was always just behind me, as if someone or something was tailing me through the woods, moving at my pace, always just out of sight. I knew I should have turned around. I should have faced whatever it was head on. But the fear, the deep, paralyzing fear, kept me moving forward. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was something natural. But as the sound continued, my rational thoughts began to dissolve. This wasn't normal. This wasn't the sound of an animal moving through the underbrush. I sped up my pace, my breathing quickening. The sound sped up too, matching my movements. It was a slow, deliberate pace, never hurrying, never rushing, but always there. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something was out there just behind me, following me. It was then that I realized something else. The forest had gone completely silent. The birds, the insects, the wind, they had all stopped. The only thing I could hear now was my own heartbeat and the strange, steady drag of something moving behind me. I broke into a run. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The sound continued, just behind me, keeping pace with my frantic movements. I ran for what felt like an eternity, my mind a blur of fear and adrenaline, until I stumbled and fell to the ground, my knees scraping against the rough forest floor. When I looked up, I was no longer on the path. I had veered off into the underbrush, my surroundings completely unfamiliar. The trees looked darker, the shadows deeper. It was as if I had crossed into a different part of the forest, somewhere far beyond the normal trails. I pushed myself to my feet, shaking, my mind racing for answers. The dragging sound had stopped. The silence was suffocating. I turned around, half expecting to see something standing behind me, but there was nothing. No person, no animal, just the oppressive silence of the woods. The silence that surrounded me in the woods felt unnatural. It was as though the air itself had thickened, making it difficult to breathe. I stood there in the dimming light, trying to steady my breathing after my sudden burst of panic. The fall had shaken me, but it wasn't just the fall that left me rattled. It was the eerie stillness that had taken over the forest. It was the overwhelming sensation that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me from the dark corners of the woods. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes on my back, and it made the hairs on my neck prickle with discomfort. As I stood there, trying to gather my thoughts, the sense of dread grew heavier, almost suffocating. Every rustle of the leaves, every movement in the trees felt amplified. My heart raced faster with each step I took, but I forced myself to keep moving forward. There had to be a way out of this forest. The path had to be nearby. I couldn't just stay here, trapped in my fear. I walked through the dense underbrush, my feet stumbling over rocks and roots that seemed to come out of nowhere. The trees around me were tall and oppressive, their branches interwoven so tightly that it felt like they were closing in on me. The shadows in the woods grew longer as the sun sank lower in the sky. I kept my eyes on the ground, not trusting the silence that filled the air. It was too complete, too unnatural. Then the sound came again. A soft dragging sound, almost like the scrape of something heavy being pulled across the ground. It wasn't far behind me this time, but it was close enough that I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. My pulse quickened, and I felt the instinctive urge to run. But this time, I forced myself to stop. I had to know what was causing that sound. If I kept running without understanding what was happening, I'd never escape this forest. I turned slowly, my breath shallow. My eyes scanned the trees, the underbrush, but there was nothing. No person, no animal, only the shadows of the trees stretching long across the ground. The dragging sound stopped as soon as I looked, as if whatever it was had vanished in an instant. But I wasn't imagining it. I knew I wasn't. I could feel it, a presence. It was in the air around me, heavy and oppressive. The same way you know someone is standing right behind you, even if you don't turn around to look. I could feel the eyes on me again. I couldn't stay here any longer. With my mind racing, I moved forward, each step feeling like a deliberate attempt to escape the weight of whatever was following me. But the further I walked, the more the forest seemed to shift around me. The trees didn't look the same anymore. The colors of the leaves were off, too dark, too muted. The air itself felt thick and damp, like it was holding something back. I glanced over my shoulder, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something. No, someone moving in the distance, just beyond the trees. But when I blinked, they were gone, as if swallowed by the shadows. The fear that had been building in my chest tightened, and I could feel my grip on my thoughts slipping. I couldn't keep running like this. I needed to understand what was going on, what was causing these feelings, these strange occurrences. So, I stopped. I took a deep breath and tried to focus on what I could see, what I could hear. My mind told me to keep moving, but I knew I needed to stop and take stock of the situation. Maybe I'd missed something, a clue, a sign that would help me make sense of the chaos around me. The forest, though, seemed to mock my attempt at calm. The silence was punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves, the soft creaking of trees, and that dragging sound, the one that never quite stopped. I thought I heard it again, but I wasn't sure. The more I listened, the more the noise seemed to distort, like it was coming from different directions all at once. I knelt down, pulling out the mat from my backpack. I had no idea where I was anymore. The trail had long since disappeared, and now I was just lost in the woods, trying to make sense of the surroundings. I spread the map out in front of me, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to orient myself. But the map seemed wrong. It didn't make sense. The paths on it didn't align with what I was seeing. There was no sign of the small stream I had crossed earlier, and the landmarks I'd passed weren't matching up. It was as if the map itself was shifting, becoming more and more distorted the longer I stared at it. I looked up, hoping for a sign of something familiar. But all I saw was more of the same dark trees, thick underbrush, and shadows stretching out in all directions. That's when I saw it. A flash of movement, not far off in the distance, caught my eye. A figure, pale and thin, darted between the trees. I could only see it for a split second, but it was enough to make my heart race. I froze, staring into the distance, waiting for the figure to reappear. But there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the endless silence of the woods. I was certain I hadn't imagined it. That figure, whatever it was, had been real. I stood up slowly, my breath shallow as I tried to calm myself. My mind raced. Should I investigate? Should I follow the figure and see where it led? Or should I stay put and try to wait this out? I had no idea what to do, but I couldn't just stand there. The figure had been real. I had to know what was going on, what was in these woods with me. I moved cautiously, making my way in the direction where I had seen the figure. The trees closed in tighter now, the darkness growing more oppressive. The air felt thicker, more difficult to breathe. I could hear the leaves crunching under my feet, the faint rustle of branches above me. But the dragging sound had stopped. There was nothing now but the quiet hum of the woods around me. I continued forward, step by careful step, my senses on high alert. The feeling of being watched was almost unbearable now. Every time I turned a corner, every time I looked around, I half expected to see the figure again, lurking in the shadows. But no matter how many times I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing. That was when I heard the sound again, the dragging. But this time, it was louder, closer, too close. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches like hands reaching for me. The sound wasn't coming from behind me anymore. It was coming from the side, from within the thicket. I couldn't see anything, but the dragging noise was unmistakable. I didn't know what it was, but I wasn't waiting to find out. I turned and bolted forward, my body moving on pure instinct. I didn't stop to look, didn't stop to listen. All I could think about was getting out of that place, getting away from whatever was out there. The further I ran, the louder the dragging sound became. It was as if something or someone was right behind me, matching my pace. I could feel it drawing closer, the sound becoming more distinct. Every step I took made it seem like the noise was right behind me, dragging itself through the underbrush, always just a few feet away. I didn't know how long I ran. My legs were burning, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I couldn't stop. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, each twist and turn only leading me deeper into the darkness. The dragging noise was relentless, following me, taunting me with its slow, steady pace. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The dragging noise stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening. I lay there in the dirt and the darkness, my mind spinning. Had I lost it? Was I just imagining all of this? The darkness had grown thick around me, and the woods felt like an endless maze of shadows. The stillness that surrounded me seemed to pulse with an energy that made my skin crawl. I was trapped physically, emotionally, mentally. There was no escape. The world felt closed in, the trees around me so tightly packed that I felt as if I were being suffocated by the forest itself. My heart was still racing from the panic of my previous flight, but the exhaustion was beginning to set in. My legs burned, my chest ached with every shallow breath I took, and my mind couldn't quite keep up with the fear that surged through me. And then, as I stood there, trying to catch my breath and figure out what to do next, it happened again, the dragging sound. But this time, it was unmistakable. This time, it wasn't just a faint sound in the distance. It was right there, close enough for me to feel it, almost like a presence moving through the underbrush. I froze, my eyes wide with terror, my mind screaming at me to run. The dragging sound grew louder, closer. My pulse thundered in my ears as I turned my head, desperately searching for any sign of what was making that noise. I couldn't see anything. The forest was too thick, too shadowed. But I knew something or someone was there. And then it emerged from the trees. It was tall, too tall. Its body was skeletal, with limbs that seemed too long for its frame. The figure moved with a jerky, unnatural grace, its face obscured by a hood or some other dark covering. I couldn't see its eyes, but I felt them. I felt them boring into me, even without seeing them. It was as if it could see straight through me, its gaze cutting into my very soul. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't human. There was something about the way it moved, the way the air around it seemed to warp, that made my blood run cold. It was as though it was both part of the forest and completely separate from it. It was both a shadow and something much darker. It was real. I stumbled backward, my legs threatening to give way beneath me. My mind screamed at me to run, but my feet refused to move. But now it was here, in front of me. It wasn't just a figment of my imagination or a trick of the forest. It was as solid and terrifying as the ground beneath my feet. I couldn't look away. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn and run, to escape, but my eyes were locked onto it, and I couldn't tear myself away. Its head tilted slightly, the movement slow and deliberate, as if it were studying me. It seemed to be savoring the fear that radiated off of me, taking its time. The dragging sound had stopped, and now the only sound in the forest was the frantic beating of my heart. The creature took a step closer, its limbs creaking and stretching in the most unnatural way. I could hear its breath, or was it my own? The air felt thick, suffocating, as though the entire forest was holding its breath. And then, just as slowly, it extended one of its long, spindly hands toward me. The fingers were long, unnaturally so, ending in claws that seemed to twitch in anticipation. I wanted to scream, but my voice was trapped in my throat. My body felt like it was made of stone, frozen in place as the creature's hand came closer, inch by agonizing inch. I didn't know what it was going to do. I didn't know if it would reach out and grab me or if it would simply disappear, leaving me standing there in the dark, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. But in that moment, there was no question about what was real and what wasn't. This thing was real. My breath caught in my throat as its clawed fingers brushed against my cheek. The coldness of its touch was unlike anything I had ever felt, ice cold, yet burning with an otherworldly heat that made my skin prickle with every second. My eyes widened, my mind racing, trying to understand what was happening, what this thing wanted. And then it spoke. The voice was faint, low, like the rustling of dead leaves in the wind, but it was unmistakable. It was a voice that didn't belong, a voice that didn't seem to belong to any living thing. It was a voice that made my blood freeze. "You shouldn't have come here." I felt a chill wash over me as the words sank into my brain. They were simple words, but their meaning hit me like a ton of bricks. I realized with a shock that it wasn't just the forest that was wrong, it was me. I wasn't meant to be here. I wasn't supposed to be wandering through these woods, lost and confused. The creature's hand retreated, but its gaze didn't leave me. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape, but I couldn't. It was as though my legs were cemented to the ground, frozen by fear. I was trapped in its gaze, trapped in the stillness of the forest. "You're not supposed to be here," it repeated, its voice softer now, almost like a sigh. "You don't belong here." My chest tightened as a sense of dread filled my entire body. I didn't belong? What did that mean? Where was I, really? I tried to speak, tried to form a sentence, but the words wouldn't come. The fear that gripped me was too overwhelming, too intense. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The creature took another step closer, its breath cold against my skin. "You've disturbed the balance," it said, its voice now like a hiss. "And now, there is a price to pay." Before I could process what it had said, it moved quick, faster than I could react. Its hand shot out, grabbing my arm with an iron grip that sent a shock of pain through my entire body. I gasped as its claws dug into my skin, the coldness of its touch seeping into my very bones. I tried to scream, tried to pull away, but it was too strong. The creature's grip was unyielding, its presence overwhelming. It pulled me toward it, and I stumbled forward, helpless in its grasp. I felt myself being dragged deeper into the woods, the shadows closing in around us. "Help me," I screamed, but the words were barely audible, lost in the thick air. There was no one here to hear me, no one here to help me. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the creature released its grip. I fell to the ground, gasping for air, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. The creature stood over me, looming like a nightmare made flesh. It was then that I understood. I wasn't the only one who had been lost in these woods. The forest had claimed others before me, and now it was claiming me. The creature didn't speak again. It didn't need to. Its eyes, the eyes I couldn't see, said everything I needed to know. The air felt heavier than ever as I lay on the forest floor, trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The creature, the thing I had encountered, the one that had spoken to me, was still standing over me, its form so unnatural, so wrong, that it seemed almost unreal. But it wasn't unreal. It was as real as the ground beneath my hands, the trees that loomed overhead, and the blood that now coated my skin from where its claws had dug in. I had no idea how long I had been lying there. Time had lost its meaning in the overwhelming terror and confusion. My chest heaved, my mind spinning with the terror that had engulfed me. It wasn't just the creature that frightened me, it was the realization that I was completely alone. Alone in these woods with something that shouldn't exist. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let it take me. The thought of it, of being trapped in this nightmare forever, was too much to bear. I had to escape. I had to find a way out. But how? Where was I even supposed to go? The creature hadn't made any more moves, hadn't said anything else, but it was still there watching me. I could feel its presence, even if I couldn't see its eyes. It was as though it had been waiting for me to make my next move. to make a choice. I knew that whatever happened next, I had to make it count. This wasn't just about finding my way out of the woods. This was about survival. This was about escaping whatever twisted force had claimed these woods as its domain. I pushed myself up, my legs shaky, my body still trembling with fear. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away from this thing, but I didn't know where to go. The forest felt endless, a labyrinth of trees and shadows, each one closing in on me. I couldn't see the path I had come from, couldn't hear anything but the eerie stillness of the woods. I glanced back at the creature. It hadn't moved. It was just standing there, watching me, its presence suffocating. Was it waiting for me to beg? To apologize? I couldn't say. All I knew was that I couldn't afford to show weakness. I had to keep moving. I had to stay strong, or I wouldn't make it out alive. Please, just let me go, I whispered, the words barely audible, but I knew it was futile. It didn't care about my pleas. It had already made its judgment. I was nothing to it. Just another intruder in its domain. But I couldn't give up. I wouldn't. There had to be a way out. I had to find it. I turned away from the creature, trying to ignore the overwhelming sense of dread that washed over me. My legs were weak, and each step I took felt heavier than the last. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing together, their gnarled branches intertwining to create a barrier I couldn't see past. The air felt thick, as though the very atmosphere was pressing down on me, suffocating me with its weight. But I kept going. For what felt like hours, I stumbled through the woods, my body screaming for rest, my mind barely able to process what was happening. Every step felt like I was moving deeper into the darkness. The path was gone, replaced by thick underbrush and tangled vines that seemed to reach out and grab at my clothes. It wasn't until I finally heard it that I realized the truth. The silence was gone. The stillness had been replaced by an eerie, low growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground, crawling up my spine. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I could feel the creature. It was still here, still following me, still watching. Panic surged through me, and my heart began to race again. The growl grew louder, closer, until I could almost feel its breath on my neck. I turned around, ready to face whatever horror was about to unfold. But there was nothing there. Just the same trees, the same shadows. The forest was as still as ever. I didn't know what to think anymore. Was the creature real? Or had it been a figment of my imagination? Had the terror and exhaustion driven me to hallucinate it? But as I stood there in the silence, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay here any longer. I couldn't risk it. I had to keep moving. I pushed forward, determined to find a way out, to escape the clutches of whatever force had trapped me here. Hours later, when my body could no longer keep up, when my legs were too weak to carry me any farther, I collapsed in a small clearing. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, my body shaking uncontrollably from the exhaustion. My mind was clouded, disoriented. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let myself rest. Not yet. And then, in the distance, I saw a break in the trees. A light, a faint glimmer of hope. Without thinking, I pushed myself up and made my way toward it. My legs were barely functioning, my body on the verge of collapse, but I kept moving. One step at a time, I forced myself toward that light. When I finally broke through the last of the trees, I found myself standing at the edge of the woods. The forest that had trapped me for what felt like an eternity was behind me. I had made it out. I had escaped. But the relief was fleeting. There was no sense of victory, no sense of triumph. The woods were still there, just beyond the clearing, dark and foreboding. I could still feel its presence, feel the weight of it pressing down on me. It wasn't over. I wasn't free. I didn't know what had happened in those woods. I didn't know what I had encountered. But I knew one thing. I would never go back. The woods had claimed me once. I wasn't going to let it do so again. And as I walked away, back toward the safety of civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That the creature, whatever it was still out there, watching, waiting for me. The question that lingered in my mind was one I could never answer. What would happen to those who wandered into those woods after me? Would they be claimed too? Or had I simply been another part of its twisted game? The only thing I knew for sure was that I would never forget what had happened in those woods. I would never forget what I had seen. The terror, the darkness, the cold, and the feeling that I had barely escaped with my life. But that was all I had now, my life. And as long as I had that, I would never stop running. Because in those woods, there was no safety. There was no escape. Only the unrelenting terror of what lurked just beyond the trees. The events that unfolded in that forest remained locked away in the deepest part of my mind, buried beneath layers of fear and confusion. Even as the years went by, even as I moved on with my life, there was always that lingering weight in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of what I had encountered. It wasn't just the creature itself, but the feeling that something far more sinister had been at work in those woods. There were stories, whispers, things that people said about the forest that I couldn't quite bring myself to believe. But every now and then, when the nights grew dark and the wind picked up, I'd feel that same chill creeping up my spine, and I'd remember. I hadn't told anyone what happened. Not a single person. How could I? What would I even say? Who would believe me? To them, I was just another hiker, lost in the woods, finding my way out. The creature, the thing that had followed me, that had tormented me in ways I couldn't fully explain, didn't belong in this world. It didn't belong in any world. It was something out of nightmares, something that couldn't possibly exist. But it did. I couldn't forget the eyes. The way they had glowed in the dark. The way the creature had stood there, watching me, as if deciding whether or not I was worth its attention. And when it finally spoke its voice so cold, so detached, like it was simply passing judgment on me, it confirmed every fear I'd ever had about the unknown. That there were things in this world, things in the dark, that had no business being here. Things that were older than the earth itself, older than the stories we tell to comfort ourselves. I'd tried to convince myself it was just a bad experience, that it was all in my head. Maybe I had been hallucinating. Maybe I was dehydrated. Maybe I was just too tired. But the terror I had felt, the gut-wrenching fear that had consumed me, it was real. Too real. And every time I walked through a forest after that, every time I went hiking or camping, that old unease would creep back in. I'd find myself looking over my shoulder, checking the shadows, listening for something, anything that wasn't quite right. But it wasn't just the forest that haunted me. It was the question that had never been answered. What was it? What was that thing? Where did it come from? Was it alone in those woods? Or was it part of something much larger? I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I've never gone back to those woods, never even thought about it. I've heard rumors, stories of other hikers who disappeared, others who had strange encounters, but I never paid much attention. I didn't want to. I didn't want to relive it. I didn't want to open that door again. But every now and then, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear something. A rustling, a sound, the feeling that something is watching me. And I know it's not over. It can never be over. I don't know what it was that followed me out of those woods, but I can't shake the feeling that it's still there, lurking, waiting. There are things in this world that we can't explain, things that defy logic and reason. And sometimes, just sometimes, those things cross paths with us. And when they do, we can only hope that we're strong enough to make it out alive. I thought I had escaped. But sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees, I wonder if it's just a reminder. A reminder that some places, some creatures, never really let go. And maybe I'm not as free as I think I am. Maybe none of us are. So as I sit here, reflecting on what happened, I can't help but think that the woods never truly let me go. The terror, the uncertainty, the lingering feeling that something is always just around the corner, those things stay with me. It's a shadow that follows me wherever I go, and though I've tried to outrun it, I know I can't. We can't. We never really escape the things that haunt us. The woods may be behind me, but what I encounter there will always stay with me. And as much as I'd like to forget, I know that I'll never truly be free from it. It was a few years ago when I had the opportunity to visit one of the most popular tourist destinations in the country. The charm of the city was undeniable, with its old architecture and narrow cobblestone streets that seemed to hold centuries of secrets. The place had that certain pull, that atmosphere which made you feel like history was lingering just beneath the surface of every stone and every building. People from all over the world flocked to experience the magic, the history, and the hidden wonders of this city. Of course, I had heard the rumors too that talk about an old hotel on the outskirts, one that had seen better days but still attracted its fair share of visitors. Now, I'm not usually the type to put much stock in ghost stories, hauntings, or anything that can't be proven with solid evidence. I prefer to take things at face value and leave the spooky stuff to the movies. But there was something about this hotel that piqued my curiosity. Maybe it was the way it was tucked away on the edge of the city, far from the tourist hotspots, or the history that came with it. No matter how much I tried to ignore it, my curiosity kept tugging at me. And so, I decided to book a room for the night. The hotel wasn't much to look at from the outside. The brick building was faded, the windows had a dusty look to them, and the entrance was a simple wooden door, barely noticeable if you weren't paying attention. But there was something undeniably inviting about it, like an old book with a worn cover that promised to reveal its secrets if you just opened it. When I arrived, I was greeted by the receptionist, an elderly man with thick glasses, who gave me a friendly smile and handed me the key to room 308. There was something about his smile that seemed a bit forced, as if he had seen too many people pass through the hotel with the same look of indifference I had. As he handed me the key, he gave me a warning one that I didn't take seriously at the time. Room 308 isn't one of our most popular rooms, he said, his voice soft but with an odd edge to it. There's nothing wrong with it, of course. But, well, some people just don't feel comfortable staying there. I thought you should know. I laughed it off. After all, I was just looking for a quiet place to rest for the night, and a room like that seemed perfect away from the hustle and bustle of the main part of the hotel. The hallway leading to my room was dimly lit, with the occasional flickering light above. The air smelled faintly of dust, and the wooden floors creaked under my feet as I walked. There was a stillness in the air, as though the hotel hadn't seen much foot traffic in years. I didn't think much of it. It was just an old building after all. When I reached room 308, I was greeted by a thick wooden door, slightly ajar. I pushed it open, and immediately the musty scent of aged wallpaper and faded carpet hit me. The room was simple but cozy: an old bed, a small dresser, a faded armchair in the corner, and a window with heavy curtains that barely let in any light. The decor was dated, but it didn't bother me. I was only there for one night, and I figured the hotel had seen better days. But the thing that struck me the most about the room wasn't the old furniture or the faded walls, it was the silence. It was an oppressive kind of silence, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. It felt thick in the air, almost tangible. I shook it off, telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. After all, who wouldn't feel a little strange in a room like that? It was just an old hotel with an old story behind it, and I was just passing through. As the day turned to evening, I unpacked my things and decided to explore the hotel a bit. The lobby was empty, save for a couple of old chairs and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been lit in decades. The walls were lined with paintings of the city from years gone by, each one capturing a moment frozen in time. The hotel's charm was undeniable, but so was its sense of decay. It was clear that it hadn't been updated in a long time, and that was part of its allure. It felt like stepping back in time. I returned to my room later that night, feeling the weight of the day's travels. The silence in the room seemed even more pronounced now. The only sound was the soft hum of the old air conditioning unit, which barely managed to keep the room cool. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself I was being silly, but as I lay in bed, my mind kept drifting back to the receptionist's words. Some people just don't feel comfortable staying there. What did he mean by that? And why had he said it in such a strange way? I rolled over to look at the clock on the nightstand. It was just past midnight. The room felt colder now, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in the last hour. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, trying to ignore the growing discomfort in my chest. That's when I heard it, the faintest sound, like a soft scratching noise coming from the corner of the room. I froze. At first, I thought it was just the old building settling, or maybe an animal outside. But the sound persisted, growing louder and more distinct. It wasn't coming from outside, though it was coming from the corner of the room, near the window. I didn't want to look, didn't want to acknowledge what I was hearing, but my body refused to let me ignore it. Slowly, I turned my head toward the corner of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing. There was nothing there. Just the heavy curtains hanging against the window, still and undisturbed. The scratching noise had stopped, too. I breathed a sigh of relief, trying to laugh at myself for getting worked up over nothing. But as I closed my eyes, trying to fall back asleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That something in the room had noticed me, and it wasn't going to let me forget it. It wasn't until the following morning that the first truly unsettling incident occurred. I woke up early, as I usually did when I traveled, before the city had fully stirred. The early sunlight filtered through the thick curtains, casting long shadows across the room. The scratching noise from the night before seemed to be a distant memory, one I had already tried to dismiss as a figment of my imagination. I told myself that it was just the building's age, the sounds of old wood creaking and shifting in the night. I stood up, stretching and rubbing my eyes, feeling the weight of a good night's rest. The air was still cool, and the morning was peaceful, the hotel silent in the early hours. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand just a little past 6. With a quick look toward the window, I figured I'd take a shower, grab a quick breakfast in the lobby, and head out to explore the city. I was determined not to let the oddities of the hotel get to me. As I made my way to the bathroom, the mirror caught my eye. It was one of those old, oval-shaped mirrors that looked out of place in the modern world, the kind you'd find in a place that didn't quite belong to time. The reflection was mostly what I'd expect, just me, standing there, staring back at my own reflection. But then, something caught my attention. For a brief moment, just as I turned away, I saw a figure standing behind me in the mirror, a tall, thin figure dressed in a black suit. It wasn't like the figure was there, and I was seeing it, no. It was as if it had appeared in the split second between glancing away and looking back. I turned quickly, my heart leaping into my throat, but the room was empty. The bathroom door was open. The only thing standing in the mirror now was me, frozen in shock. I shook my head, mentally scolding myself for letting my mind run wild. "It's just the lighting," I whispered to myself, trying to reassure my racing heart. The old hotel tricks the eyes. Nothing more. I forced myself to take a deep breath and proceed with my morning routine, still feeling a hint of unease creeping in. But I figured if I was going to be staying in a place like this, I might as well get used to it. The oddities, the strange quirks, maybe it was just the ambience of a building that had seen more years than I could fathom. When I stepped out of the bathroom, I immediately noticed something strange. The chair in the corner of the room had moved. The armchair, which had been tucked neatly against the wall when I arrived the previous day, was now positioned directly in front of the window, facing it as if someone had placed it there intentionally. I walked over, my steps hesitant, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. There was no way I could have moved the chair in my sleep, and there was no one else in the room with me. I briefly checked the door, confirming that it had remained locked the entire night. It was a subtle change, almost insignificant, but it struck me in a way that left me feeling unsettled. I looked around the room, hoping to find something that would explain this oddity, but everything else remained just as I had left it. The bed was neatly made. The dresser was untouched. The only change was that damn chair. I stood there for a long moment, my mind racing. Could the chair have moved on its own somehow? Maybe the floorboards had shifted, but the movement felt too deliberate, too purposeful for a simple shift of wood or the wind. And yet, the idea that someone else could have been in the room while I was asleep seemed ridiculous. The door was locked, and I had no memory of anyone entering. My instincts were telling me to chalk it up to my own forgetfulness or some weird quirk of the old furniture. I didn't want to entertain any other thoughts. Not yet. The rest of the morning passed uneventfully. I quickly grabbed breakfast in the lobby, a simple meal of eggs, toast, and coffee, and tried to shake off the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. By the time I was back in my room, I was determined to go about my day as planned. I was a logical person after all. I didn't believe in ghosts, spirits, or any other supernatural nonsense. What had happened in the night was just a trick of the mind, and the chair, well, maybe it was simply a case of me forgetting where I had left it. But as I was about to leave the room, I noticed something else that made my stomach tighten. The curtains, those heavy, dark curtains I had left firmly drawn the night before, were now parted. The fabric had been pushed back, just slightly, as if someone had opened them to look outside. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Had I done that myself? I didn't think so. The curtains were thick and heavy. They didn't open easily without some effort. But once again, I had no clear explanation. I glanced toward the door, confirming it was still locked, and made my way over to the window. I had a sudden, irrational urge to check outside, even though I had no reason to believe anyone had been in the room. As I pulled the curtains back further, I saw the quiet street below, bathed in the soft light of the morning. There was nothing out of the ordinary, no one lingering outside the window, no signs of life, except for a few people walking by on the cobblestone streets below. Still, I couldn't shake the unease I felt. Something about the room just didn't sit right with me. The strange occurrences, however subtle, had started to pile up, and the more I thought about them, the more unnerving they became. I stood there, at the window, for what felt like an eternity, wondering if I was just overthinking it. But the logical part of me was growing restless. What if these little things weren't just coincidences? What if there was something more to this room than I was willing to acknowledge? When I finally left the hotel to explore the city, I did so with a sense of reluctance. There was still a knot of discomfort in my stomach, but I pushed it aside. The morning had been uneventful, and I was determined not to let the weirdness of the room ruin my time in such a beautiful city. I told myself I would return later, sleep another night, and leave the strange events behind me. But as I walked through the city's winding streets, with its beautiful old buildings and charming little shops, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't a literal sensation, of course not something I could point to or describe, but there was an odd weight in the air, a pressure I couldn't ignore. I could feel it pressing against my chest as if something was waiting, watching, and biding its time. When I returned to the hotel that evening, I was ready to put the strange incidents behind me. It was just a hotel room after all, just an old, creaky place. But the truth is, I wasn't so sure anymore. The room, with its eerie silence and inexplicable oddities, felt like something more. Something I couldn't explain. Something that would only reveal itself in time. And as I settled back into that room, I couldn't help but wonder just how much time I had left before everything would change. The events that had begun as fleeting moments, easily dismissed as tricks of the mind or the quirks of an old building, quickly escalated in ways I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just one unsettling incident, it was an accumulation of small, inexplicable events, each one stacking upon the last. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle in the air, seemed to add to the growing sense of unease that had settled in my chest. But what struck me most was how it felt as if I was being watched, as though something in the room had become aware of my presence. The night following the strange occurrences with the curtains and the chair was no different. I had returned to my room late, exhausted from a day of exploring the city. As I crossed the threshold, I was once again hit with the heavy, stifling air of the room. It wasn't necessarily a bad air, it just felt wrong, thick, as if it was hard to breathe. I dismissed it at first, attributing it to the mustiness of the old building, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. The room seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something. I glanced around. Nothing had changed. No chair moved, no curtains disturbed. But it was the silence that unnerved me most. It was so complete, so thick, it felt like the room itself was watching, waiting. I dropped my bag on the bed and stretched, trying to shake off the heaviness that seemed to cling to the air. But that was when it happened again. A soft thud echoed from somewhere deep in the room, a noise that seemed to reverberate through the walls. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but I could feel it, the deep, unsettling pulse of sound that seemed to come from somewhere within the very walls. I froze, listening intently. My mind scrambled to find an explanation. Maybe it was the plumbing, the building settling. But it wasn't like anything I had ever heard before, not the usual creaks of an old structure. It was deliberate. I moved cautiously toward the source of the noise, the corner near the window. The floor beneath my feet creaked with each step, the old wood groaning in protest. I could feel my heart racing, but I didn't stop. I had to know. The closer I got to the corner, the more the sensation of being watched intensified. It was like a prickling at the back of my neck, a feeling that someone or something was standing just out of sight. When I reached the corner, I stood still for a moment, my breath shallow. The room seemed to be holding its breath as well. I dared to take a step forward, my hand slowly reaching for the wall, tracing the rough texture of the old plaster. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and I could feel it on my skin, a cold, biting chill that seemed to come from nowhere. And then, as if on cue, another thud, louder this time, followed by a soft scraping sound. It was coming from the closet. My body went stiff. I could barely hear the sound of my own heartbeat thumping in my ears as I slowly turned toward the closet door. The old wooden door was slightly ajar, just enough for a sliver of darkness to peek through. I felt a surge of adrenaline, but my legs wouldn't move. I had to look. I had to see what was inside. With trembling hands, I reached for the door, my fingers brushing against the cool, smooth surface of the wood. The scraping sound came again, louder this time, as if something was dragging across the floor inside the closet. I flung the door open. Empty. There was nothing in there but the usual assortment of hangers and shelves. I stood frozen for a long moment, staring into the empty closet. my breath coming out in shallow gasps. It didn't make sense. The noises had been real, there was no denying that. But there was nothing in the closet, just the eerie silence that seemed to fill the room. I closed the closet door slowly, my mind racing. Maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe it was just the building settling again, or perhaps it was the weight of the room playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I walked around the room, trying to regain some sense of control. The faint odor of dust and old wood hung in the air, thick and oppressive, and the sense of being watched lingered, making my skin crawl. As I stood near the window, I looked outside, trying to calm my mind. The street below was quiet, almost deserted in the dim light of dusk. The world beyond the window seemed so normal, so real. Yet the air inside the room felt thick, suffocating. I felt like I was trapped in a space that wasn't entirely my own. I decided to investigate further. I opened the door to the hallway, stepping out into the dimly lit corridor. The floorboards creaked underfoot as I made my way down the hall, glancing at the other rooms that lined the corridor. They were all silent, their doors closed and their windows dark. But something felt off. There was an emptiness, a stillness that hung in the air. It was as if the hotel itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I stopped in front of the elevator, unsure if I should press the button and go down to the lobby. Maybe I was overreacting, but the feeling of unease was growing stronger by the minute. I could hear the faint sound of the building settling, the distant groans of the old wood, but there was something more, something beneath the surface. It felt like the entire hotel was whispering, its ancient walls trying to communicate something to me. With a deep breath, I decided to explore the lower floors. I made my way down the stairs, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The air was colder here, a noticeable drop in temperature as I moved farther away from my room. I didn't know what I was hoping to find, maybe a sign that the building was simply old and in disrepair, or perhaps some kind of rational explanation for the strange events that had been happening. But the deeper I went, the more the silence seemed oppressive around me. I walked past empty rooms and dark hallways, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath my feet. The farther I ventured, the more oppressive the silence became. It felt as though the very walls were closing in, like the hotel itself was a living, breathing entity. When I reached the lower level, the air grew even colder. I shivered, wrapping my arms around myself as I moved deeper into the shadows. The faint hum of the ventilation system was the only sound that broke the eerie stillness. I turned a corner and found myself in a long, narrow hallway, one I hadn't noticed before. The walls were lined with old paintings, their frames cracked and faded from years of neglect. The entire hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the end disappearing into darkness. And then I saw a figure standing at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the dim light. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. The figure was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and its face was obscured by the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it wasn't supposed to be there. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. But before I could get any closer, the figure vanished. It was as if it had never been there at all, disappearing into the darkness with no trace. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my body frozen in fear. I didn't know what to think or what to do. Was I losing my mind? Was I being haunted? All I knew was that I had to get out of there. As quickly as I could, I turned and fled back down the hallway, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts as I made my way back to the stairs. The strange figure, the cold, oppressive air, it was too much. I needed answers, but I also needed to leave the hotel before whatever it was could find me. The building felt different now, its silence no longer a comfort, but an oppressive force. The weight of the atmosphere was unbearable as I returned to my room after the unsettling encounter in the hallway. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, rationalizing it as exhaustion or my mind playing tricks. But deep down, something had shifted. The strange, oppressive energy that I had ignored before now clung to the air like a thick fog. I tried to force myself to rest, but sleep was impossible. Every creak of the floor, every shift in the air, sent my mind into a spiral. The room felt alive, as though something in it was aware of my every movement, watching, waiting for the right moment. It felt suffocating. The old clock on the wall ticked loudly, its rhythmic sound the only thing that broke the silence. But even that seemed to echo in my skull, louder and louder until it was all I could hear. Time itself felt distorted, as though it was moving slower, stretching out the moments of dread and discomfort. I glanced at the door, half expecting to see someone standing on the other side, but there was nothing but the quiet hallway. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the door, my heart hammering in my chest. But then, the silence was broken. It started with a faint sound, barely perceptible, as though something was scratching against the door. It wasn't loud, not at first, but it was enough to freeze me in place. I could hear it, the soft scrape, like nails on wood, dragging, slow, deliberate. My heart stopped, and I swallowed hard. My eyes never left the door. The sound continued, growing louder, more urgent, until I could feel it vibrating through the floorboards beneath my feet. It was almost as if the door itself was alive, something trying to break through from the other side. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to close in on me. Then, suddenly, the scratching stopped. For a moment, everything was eerily still. The silence was deafening, but it didn't last long. A loud bang hit the door, sharp and forceful, making me jump in shock. My body was frozen with fear, but my mind was racing. I knew I had to open the door. There was no turning back now. I reached for the handle, my hand shaking uncontrollably. The coldness of the brass seemed to seep into my skin as I turned it, the door creaking open with an agonizing slowness. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, and I couldn't seem to draw enough air into my lungs. What I saw beyond the door will haunt me for the rest of my life. Standing in the hallway was a figure, shrouded in darkness, tall and gaunt. Its face was obscured by a black hood, but there was no mistaking the hollow emptiness in the space where its eyes should have been. The figure stood perfectly still, as if waiting, as if it had been there for an eternity, just out of sight. Watching me, a chill ran through me, deeper than the cold air in the room. This wasn't just any figure. It wasn't a person. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist. The figure took a step toward me, its movements slow, deliberate, and utterly unnatural. As it moved, I could feel the air around me grow colder, thicker, pressing in on me from all sides. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It felt like a dream, a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. The figure raised a hand, its fingers long and bony, reaching for me. There was no sound, no words, just the eerie sensation that something was pulling me in. I could feel it, a force, something ancient and malevolent, pushing me forward. My legs were like lead, unable to move, while my heart thundered in my chest. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The cold, the darkness, all of it was gone. I stood in the doorway, alone in the empty hallway. There was no figure, no sign of what I had just seen. It was as if it had never been there at all. But the fear lingered, deep inside me, gnawing at my soul. I slammed the door shut, my back pressed against it as I sank to the floor. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I struggled to make sense of what had just happened. Was it a hallucination? Had my mind cracked under the pressure of everything? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It wasn't just a trick of the mind. That thing, whatever it was real, and it was still out there. I couldn't stay in the room anymore. I couldn't stay in that hotel, not with whatever had just happened. My mind raced with thoughts of escape, of getting out before it could happen again. But before I could act, there was a knock at the door. Soft, insistent. A knock that echoed through the silence of the room, louder than anything before. I froze, And then I heard a voice. It was faint, barely a whisper, but I could hear it clearly, as if it was coming from right behind the door. "Let me in." The voice was deep, guttural, as though it didn't belong in this world. It wasn't human. It was something else. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The world seemed to collapse around me, closing in tighter with every passing second. The knocking continued, louder now, more urgent, each thud shaking the door, rattling the frame. I scrambled to my feet, my legs unsteady, my mind a chaotic mess of fear and panic. I couldn't stay. I couldn't wait to see what would happen next. I rushed toward the window, throwing it open and looking out at the street below. It was dark, and there was no one in sight. I turned back to the room. The door was still shaking, still echoing with those dreadful knocks. But I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my things, rushing out of the room and down the hallway, my footsteps frantic against the old wooden floors. The building felt different as I ran through the corridor, more oppressive, more alive. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air growing colder with each passing step. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just had to get out. But as I reached the stairs, I stopped dead in my tracks. At the bottom of the stairs, there stood the figure again, just like before, waiting, watching. Its empty gaze pierced through me, and I felt the cold grip of fear tighten around my chest. I turned and ran the other way, out of the building, into the night, away from whatever was haunting me, away from that hotel. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of the nearest streetlight. But even now, after all this time, I can still feel the weight of those eyes, still hear the knock on the door. It's like the hotel is still with me, haunting me from the shadows. I could still feel the presence of the figure, that cold and oppressive energy, clinging to me even as I stood under the streetlight. The fear that gripped my chest refused to loosen, and my mind was a whirlwind of confusion. What had just happened? Was it real? Was I losing my mind? I didn't know the answers, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know. All I knew was that I had to get as far away from that hotel as possible. I couldn't stay there, not after what I had seen, what I had felt. There was no logical explanation for any of it, no reason why the hotel had turned into something that felt like a nightmare come to life. All I had were the lingering images, the smell of cold air, and the feeling that something was waiting for me in the shadows. I stumbled away from the hotel, my body numb, my mind still reeling. The night felt colder than it had before, as though the very earth was pressing down on me, urging me to leave. My feet moved faster, almost as if they had a mind of their own, carrying me away from the place that had become a prison. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if the figure was still watching me, or if it was following me. I didn't want to know. As I walked, I could feel the world around me shifting, becoming less real. The streetlights flickered above, casting long shadows that stretched across the sidewalk. The buildings around me, once familiar, now seemed distant, alien, as if I had walked into a different world, a world where nothing made sense. But I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that I wasn't truly free. The hotel, the figure, the strange events, they were all still with me, like an itch I couldn't scratch. The memories of what I had seen, what I had heard, were burned into my mind, replaying over and over like a twisted movie. I couldn't stop thinking about the voice at the door, the cold that had seeped into my bones, and the feeling that something far darker than I could comprehend was waiting just behind the veil of reality. It wasn't long before I reached the bus station, a place that felt like a haven after everything I had just experienced. I stood there for a moment, my breath visible in the air, a steady stream of fog in the cold night. The bus would take me far from here, away from that cursed hotel and whatever dark force haunted it. As I waited for the bus, my mind kept drifting back to the figure. Was it something that had always been there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make its presence known? Or had it followed me from somewhere else? I didn't know, and I didn't have the strength to search for answers. The bus arrived, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a beacon of hope. I climbed aboard, finding a seat by the window, and watched as the world outside passed by. The city's lights blurred together as the bus pulled away, leaving the hotel and everything that had happened behind me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness hadn't truly been left behind. Even now, I'm not sure what happened that night. Was it all a hallucination? A trick of the mind brought on by stress or exhaustion? Or was it something far worse, something that I still can't fully comprehend? The questions have haunted me ever since, lingering in the back of my mind like a persistent whisper I can't quite understand. But one thing I do know is that I'll never return to that hotel. I'll never set foot in that place again, and I'll never forget the cold presence that waited for me in the darkness. And as for the figure, well, I can't say for sure that I've seen the last of it. Some things aren't meant to be understood. Some things, once seen, can never be unseen. As the days passed, the weight of what had happened in that hotel room remained with me. It was as though I had crossed a line that should never have been crossed, stepping into a world that I wasn't meant to understand. But the truth is, I don't know what happened. No one else can give me an answer, and I can't seem to find peace in trying to explain it. In the weeks that followed, I kept myself busy work, friends, routines, but nothing could shake the feeling that I had somehow lost something. How could I? What words could I use to describe what I had seen, what I had felt? People wouldn't believe me. And even if they did, would it make any difference? Would it bring me back to a time before the fear, before the dark presence that seemed to haunt me? Every now and then, I would find myself drifting back to that moment, the door creaking open, the icy gust of air, the figure that appeared from nowhere. The image was seared into my mind. No matter how many times I tried to bury it, it would resurface, always at night when the world was quiet, when I was alone with my thoughts. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, and wonder if it had really happened. Was it my mind playing tricks on me? Or was there something more to it, something sinister that had followed me from the depths of the hotel? It was during one of these sleepless nights that I made a decision that would ultimately change my perspective forever. I returned to the hotel. It wasn't something I had planned. It wasn't something I had wanted to do. But the questions, the need for closure, pushed me to make the journey back. I had to know. I had to see it with my own eyes, one last time, to understand whether I was losing my grip on reality or if the hotel truly was what I had felt it to be. When I arrived, the building seemed unchanged. The same decrepit facade, the same fading paint, the same eerie stillness in the air. But there was something different this time, a palpable sense of dread that clung to the place like a thick fog. I hesitated as I stood in front of the hotel, my feet rooted to the ground, my pulse quickening. Could I really do this? Could I really step inside again and face whatever was waiting for me? I thought about turning back, about leaving this haunted chapter behind. But there was no escaping it, not in my mind, not in my heart. The fear, the unanswered questions, they were like chains, pulling me forward. I stepped inside. The lobby was quiet, eerily so, just like the first time I had entered. The same flickering light, the same strange silence. The air felt cold, even colder than before, as though the temperature dropped the moment I crossed the threshold. I didn't know what I was expecting. A ghostly apparition? A sign that I wasn't imagining things? But nothing happened, not at first. The hotel seemed abandoned, untouched by time. It felt more like a dream than a reality, as if the place existed only in the shadows of my mind. I made my way up the stairs, the same stairs I had climbed that fateful night. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last, the sound reverberating through the empty halls. I reached the door to the room where everything had changed. My heart raced as I stood there, hand resting on the doorknob, waiting for something, anything to happen. The door opened. Inside, the room was as it had been the night I checked in, stale air, peeling wallpaper, the creaky bed. There was no sign of the figure, no sign of the cold presence that had haunted me. It was as if nothing had ever happened at all. But I knew better than to think that the hotel was simply a relic of the past. I had felt it, I had seen it, and I wasn't going to leave until I had answers. I walked into the room, the floorboards groaning beneath my feet. Everything was still. Too still. The silence was oppressive, suffocating. I stood in the middle of the room, my breath shallow, my senses on high alert. The air felt thick with tension, as if the very walls were closing in around me. And then I heard it. A whisper. Soft, faint, barely audible over the beating of my heart. But it was there. It was unmistakable. I froze. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The whispers seemed to come from the very air itself, curling around me, brushing against my skin like a cold hand. The sound was so familiar, yet so distant. It was the voice I had heard that night, the voice that had spoken to me from the shadows. I turned, eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing there. No figure. No movement. Just the empty room, its shadows stretching across the floor like long fingers reaching out to claim me. And in that moment, I understood. The hotel wasn't just a building. It wasn't just a place. It was something older, something darker. It existed in the space between the living and the dead, a place where the past and present bled together. And whatever had happened that night, it wasn't over. It wasn't finished. As I turned to leave, I heard it again, the whisper, low and soft, but unmistakably there. You shouldn't have come back. The door slammed shut behind me, and that was the last time I set foot in that hotel. It was a regular Tuesday, just like any other. I had just gotten out of a long shift at work and was looking forward to a quiet evening at home. The city streets were busy as usual. The sounds of cars and the faint hum of people moving around filled the air. It had been a typical day, filled with the usual office meetings, phone calls, and the dull hum of the air conditioner keeping things cool inside the building. But what happened next, what I experienced that evening, is something I'll never forget. It completely shattered my sense of what's possible, and no matter how many years go by, I can still feel the chill creeping down my spine when I think back on it. The office building I worked in wasn't particularly old, but it had a certain character. It was one of those places that felt a little worn down, yet comfortable. The kind of place that becomes familiar and almost comforting, despite its imperfections. The fluorescent lights buzzed above as I made my way to the elevator, pushing the button for the ground floor. It had been a long day, and all I wanted to do was get home, unwind, and forget about the stress of work. I wasn't alone in the elevator. There were a couple of other people there, each lost in their own thoughts. The doors slid closed with a soft ding, and the soft whir of the elevator began as it slowly made its way down. I stood there, my mind drifting, thinking about dinner plans and the rest of the evening ahead. I barely paid attention as the floors passed by. It was just another ride down at the end of a long day. But then, something strange happened. As the elevator passed the third floor, I felt a subtle jolt. At first, I thought nothing of it. I assumed it was just the building's old elevator system, maybe a minor glitch. But then, the elevator didn't stop at the second floor like it should have. It just kept descending. I glanced at the other people in the elevator. They hadn't seemed to notice. One was engrossed in their phone, the other staring blankly at the wall. The soft ding sound signaled the passing of yet another floor, but I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. It didn't make sense. The elevator should have stopped at the second floor. Why was it still going down? I looked up at the display, expecting to see the numbers counting down to the ground floor. But instead, the numbers froze. 2, 1, and then nothing. It was as if the elevator had stopped moving entirely. The doors didn't open. The familiar chime that signaled the arrival at the ground floor never came. Instead, we were suspended in this strange, motionless silence. It was as though we were trapped between two worlds. The other passengers began to fidget. One woman muttered something under her breath about the elevator being broken. I pressed the emergency button, but there was no response. The silence stretched out, and the only sound was the occasional clink of the elevator cables overhead. I was starting to feel that familiar knot of discomfort in my stomach. You know the feeling when something doesn't seem right, when the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, but you can't quite explain why. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. It was just a glitch, right? But then the elevator lurched again. This time, I was certain it wasn't just my imagination. I could feel it in my bones, the sensation that something was off, that we were no longer just riding down. We were descending into something else entirely. I glanced around the small space, looking for any sign of normalcy. But the more I looked, the more I noticed that something was wrong. The lights above flickered once, then twice. The smooth metallic walls of the elevator, which usually looked so clean and polished, seemed to shimmer slightly, as if they were made of something other than solid steel. The feeling in my gut worsened, and I reached for my phone. There was no signal. It wasn't even that there was a lack of signal. It was as if my phone had been completely disconnected from the world. The woman next to me shifted uncomfortably, but she didn't say anything. Neither did the man standing in the corner, who had been quietly eyeing the numbers as they failed to change. He finally cleared his throat and spoke in a low voice. "Is the elevator supposed to be doing this?" he asked, his voice a mix of confusion and anxiety. I didn't know what to say. "I don't know," I replied, the uncertainty clear in my voice. "It must be broken." But even as the words left my mouth, I couldn't help but feel that something deeper was going on. It wasn't just a broken elevator. Something else was at play here. The woman beside me, her hand trembling slightly, pressed the emergency button again. Still nothing. I began to wonder if the elevator was even connected to the building system anymore. Was it stuck? Or was it doing something else? Then, as if answering my unspoken question, the elevator gave another jolt. This time, the sound wasn't like anything I had heard before. It was deep, hollow, as if something massive had shifted beneath the building. The lights flickered again, this time going completely dark. The elevator was plunged into an eerie blackness that felt thick, almost suffocating. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing against me, as though it were trying to force its way into my mind. But before I could react, the lights came back on. The elevator seemed to move again, and for a moment, it felt as though everything had returned to normal. The numbers on the display began to move downward, one by one, as though the elevator was picking up speed. As the elevator continued its descent, I knew we were heading for something I couldn't yet understand, something that would change everything. The elevator continued its descent, but the atmosphere had changed. The normal hum of the building's machinery had disappeared, replaced by an unsettling silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes with peace. It was the kind that makes you feel like you're not alone, even when you are. The faint, almost imperceptible sound of air moving in and out of the ventilation system felt loud now, as if the air itself was struggling to breathe. The numbers on the display slowly ticked down 3, 2, 1. But just as the elevator should have arrived at the ground floor, it stopped again. This time, there was no jolt, no lurch. It just froze. I glanced at the others in the elevator, and that's when I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The woman who had been standing beside me, she was staring at the wall, her eyes wide and unblinking. At first, I thought she was just anxious, maybe disoriented from the sudden halt of the elevator. But there was something different about her stare. It wasn't just worry or frustration. It was as if she were looking through the wall, through the very building itself, her gaze fixed on something far beyond our reality. I tried to make eye contact with her to gauge if she was all right, but she didn't respond. Her hands were clenched by her sides, her body rigid. I felt a strange sense of urgency rising in me, but I couldn't place it. Was something wrong with her? Or was it the elevator itself that was causing this odd reaction? "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice a little too loud in the silence. The man in the corner shifted nervously, glancing between the woman and me. She didn't answer. Her lips were pressed tightly together, but she made a low, almost inaudible sound, a sound that seemed to come from deep within her chest. It wasn't a word, not a cry for help. It was more like a murmur, a hum, like she was trying to block out the world around her. The man stepped forward, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch her arm. "Hey, are you all right?" At his touch, the woman snapped out of her trance, her head jerking toward him with a suddenness that made both of us take a step back. Her eyes were wide, her pupils dilated, as if she had just woken up from a long, deep sleep. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice sharp and strained. It was a stark contrast to the way she had been before, her earlier silence replaced with a sudden, intense awareness. She backed away from him, retreating into the far corner of the elevator. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and the tension in this small space was palpable. The elevator still hadn't moved, but now it felt like we were stuck in some strange, isolated bubble. It was as if the world outside had ceased to exist. I felt the weight of the walls closing in around us, the confined space pressing down on my shoulders. I looked at the display again. The numbers were stuck on 1, not moving at all. It was as if time itself had been frozen. The stillness in the elevator was overwhelming. Even the faint hum of the building's power system had vanished, leaving an eerie quiet in its wake. "What's going on?" I muttered under my breath, more to myself than to anyone else. I could feel the knot in my stomach tightening. This wasn't just a malfunctioning elevator anymore. It felt like something else, something beyond explanation. The man spoke up, his voice tight with unease. "This doesn't feel right. What the hell is going on?" I nodded, but before I could answer, the woman suddenly gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as if she had just realized something. I shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. Her words were so soft that I could barely hear them over the pounding in my own ears. "I wasn't supposed to come down here. I wasn't supposed to." She trailed off, her breath quickening, and I could see her shaking now, her hands clutched tightly around the straps of her bag. Her eyes darted around the elevator, as if searching for something, or perhaps someone. It was as if she could feel it, whatever was wrong, but she didn't know how to put it into words. The man stepped back from her, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean? Where are we supposed to be going?" But she didn't answer. Instead, she closed her eyes tightly, as though trying to block out everything around her. The rest of us stood in silence, unsure of what to do. The tension was thick now, unspoken fear hung in the air. And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the elevator lurched again. The noise this time was different. It wasn't the familiar sound of the building's mechanics struggling to operate. It was something deeper, something unnatural. It was as if the very elevator shaft was groaning, as though it were protest its own existence. The woman screamed, her voice raw and full of terror. She pressed herself into the corner, clutching her knees to her chest, her body trembling violently. I couldn't help but feel a wave of panic wash over me. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a malfunction or a glitch in the system. This was something far worse. I didn't know what was happening, but I felt a deep, gnawing fear creeping through me, settling into the pit of my stomach. We weren't just stuck. We were somewhere else. The man in the corner had been quiet for too long, and now he spoke again, his voice shaky. "We need to get out of here. We need to figure this out." I nodded, though I had no idea how to make that happen. The elevator wasn't responding to any of the buttons. The emergency system wasn't working. It felt like we were trapped, suspended between two places, a place that didn't make sense and one that didn't exist. We were all staring at the woman now, watching her as she continued to rock back and forth, her eyes wide and unblinking. It was clear that she was in some kind of shock, but there was something more than just fear in her eyes. There was recognition. She knew something that we didn't, something that she couldn't or wouldn't share with us. And then, without warning, the elevator made one final, horrifying sound. A deep, guttural groan, like the building itself was about to collapse. The lights flickered one last time. And then, everything went dark. The sudden darkness hit like a blow to the chest. It wasn't like a simple flicker of a light bulb or a brief power outage. It was complete and utter darkness. No sound, no motion, nothing. Just the overwhelming sensation of being swallowed up by the void. I tried to steady my breath, but I could feel my heart racing, each beat echoing through the silent space. The cold air around me felt heavier now, like it was pressing in, suffocating me. I reached out into the blackness, my hand brushing the cool metal of the elevator's walls. The sense of isolation was suffocating. The kind of silence that doesn't just make you uneasy, it makes you question whether you're really alone. The woman's soft breathing was the only thing I could hear, though it was erratic and shallow. Her presence in the corner felt almost like an anchor, though her sudden outburst had left me unsettled. In this void, there was nothing else to focus on, nothing else to hold on to except the fear settling in my chest like lead. After what felt like hours, though it was probably only moments, the elevator lights flickered back to life. But the scene before me was no longer the same. The hum of the elevator system had returned, but something felt off, like an unfamiliar vibration running through the building. The metallic scent of the air was now mixed with something else, something damp and almost earthy. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it made my skin crawl. I glanced around, trying to make sense of everything. The numbers on the display had reset, and now, instead of counting down to the ground floor, it showed an unfamiliar floor G, though the building's plans didn't list a floor by that name. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was the elevator malfunctioning, or was it something more? Something deeper? The man who had been standing by the door earlier stepped forward, his movements stiff, like he was walking through treacle. He reached for the emergency button and pressed it, but nothing happened. There was no response. Not even a flicker of light or sound. He tried it again, his hand growing sweaty against the cold panel. But there was still nothing. I could feel my throat tightening. Panic was rising, clawing at my chest. I couldn't just stand there and do nothing, but at the same time, I didn't know what to do. We were trapped in this confined space, and every move seemed to make the situation worse. The woman in the corner made a soft sound, almost like a whisper, but it wasn't directed at us. It was like she was speaking to someone or something else. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was low and tremulous, like she was pleading, but with an edge of recognition. Like she knew something was coming, but didn't know how to stop it. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked again, my voice feeling too loud in the stillness. She didn't answer. But then, as I stared at her, something else caught my attention. The air in the elevator seemed to shift, like something was moving through it. It wasn't wind, but it felt like a change in temperature, a sudden drop in warmth. The kind of chill that crawls down your spine and settles in your bones. I turned to look at the man, but his face was pale. His eyes were wide, his pupils dilated. "Did you feel that?" he whispered. His voice was barely audible, trembling with fear. Before I could respond, the sound of something heavy moving above us echoed through the elevator shaft, so loud and jarring that I jumped. It wasn't like the normal creaking of the building. This was something far more deliberate. Something that didn't belong. "What was that?" the man gasped. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing, my thoughts scrambling to make sense of the situation. Was there someone else in the building? Were we hearing the building's structure shifting? Or was it something else, something far worse? Then, without warning, the elevator jerked again. This time, it was more violent, more forceful. The sensation was like being tossed in a cage, the sudden movement making my stomach drop. And for a moment, I felt as if I might be thrown to the ceiling. The woman screamed again, her voice filled with terror as she pressed herself further into the corner. I could see her hands clutched tightly around her bag, her knuckles white from the pressure. "I told you," she gasped between breaths, her voice shaking. "I told you it wasn't safe. You shouldn't have come down here." I tried to make sense of her words, but the panic was starting to cloud my thoughts. I couldn't stay in this elevator any longer. I had to get out. I had to know what was happening. We had to figure this out before it was too late. "Maybe we should try the emergency exit," I suggested, though my voice didn't carry the confidence I had hoped. The man looked at me as if I had just suggested we break the law, but the way he looked at me, it was a mixture of desperation and fear. It was as if he was beginning to realize that we weren't in any ordinary elevator, that we weren't just trapped in a malfunctioning lift. The woman didn't speak. Her eyes were unfocused again, her mind seemingly somewhere else. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as the air grew colder, almost frigid. And then the sound returned. A slow, rhythmic thumping came from above, steady and deliberate, like footsteps marching in the darkness of the shaft. It was faint at first, so quiet I almost thought I had imagined it. But then it grew louder, closer, and then it stopped altogether. And in the silence that followed, we all heard it, a voice. It wasn't clear, and it wasn't anything I recognized, but it was there. A low murmur, almost indistinguishable, but with a quality that sent chills down my spine. It was as though the voice was coming from the very walls of the elevator, from the darkness itself. A voice that wasn't speaking to us, but to something else. Something far older, far darker than anything we could comprehend. The air thickened, the tension in the elevator suffocating. And then, with a suddenness that felt like a punch to the gut, the display flickered again. The numbers were gone, replaced with an empty space. We weren't on a normal floor anymore. We had descended to somewhere that didn't exist. The elevator had taken us to a place where time didn't seem to behave, where the laws of physics had become mere suggestions. With the numbers on the display flickering out of existence, we had no way of knowing where we were or when. The coldness had reached a point where it almost felt like we were standing in a freezer. My breath came out in visible puffs, and my fingers ached from the chill. But it wasn't just the temperature that was suffocating. It was the oppressive weight of something watching us from the shadows, a presence so tangible, it was almost as if the very walls of the elevator were closing in around us. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest. Every beat seemed louder, more frantic than the last. It was hard to think, hard to focus, with everything around me feeling so wrong. The air felt thick, charged, like something was about to happen. Something I couldn't stop, no matter how hard I tried. Then it happened. A loud, jarring noise split the silence, a crash that seemed to come from deep within the elevator shaft. It reverberated in the confined space like the sound of something heavy being thrown down a tunnel. I felt my stomach drop as I realized we were no longer moving vertically. The elevator had stopped, but we weren't on solid ground. It was as if we were suspended in midair. "So, what was that?" the man gasped, his voice quivering with fear. I turned toward the woman, expecting her to be as shaken as the rest of us. But when I looked at her, she wasn't the same. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and fixed on the far corner of the elevator. She was completely still, her body rigid, and her lips. They moved ever so slightly, as though she were whispering to someone or something on the other side of the room. "Get ready," she said, her voice low and trembling. "What's happening?" I demanded, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. The air felt alive now, charged with an energy I couldn't comprehend. Suddenly, without warning, the elevator shook again, this time more violently. I grabbed onto the metal bars for support, but it wasn't enough. The force of the movement was so strong, it felt as if the entire structure was going to collapse around us. My head slammed against the side of the elevator, and I felt the world spin around me. The woman's grip tightened on her bag, her knuckles as white as the walls that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. And then, Just as quickly as it had started, everything went still. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was our breathing, ragged and shallow, as we tried to process what had just happened. I turned to the man, but he was frozen, staring at the elevator door as if in a trance. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and there was something wrong about them. Like he wasn't seeing what was in front of him, but something far beyond the physical realm. Before I could speak, the door in front of us let out a creak, the metal grinding against itself as it slowly, agonizingly began to open. And what we saw on the other side was something that should never have been. There was no floor, no walls, no ceiling. It was just an endless expanse of shadow, stretching out into a void that seemed to stretch forever. The elevator doors had opened not onto another floor, but into something impossible. The air smelled thick, almost metallic, and the distant sound of something shifting like massive footsteps reached our ears. The cold intensified, the darkness pressing in closer, suffocating us. We were standing on the precipice of something ancient, something that had never been meant to exist in our world. What? What is this? I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. The woman spoke again, but this time her voice was different. It was deeper, almost like it wasn't her voice at all. This is where you are meant to be. All of you. The ones who came down here. The man took a step back, his face pale, sweat pouring down his forehead. No, I don't. But before he could finish his sentence, something beyond the void stirred. A presence, vast and dark, moving in the space between us and the abyss. The air vibrated with an intensity I could feel deep in my bones. A low hum, as if something was breathing, was growing louder, louder, until it became a deafening roar. And then the figure appeared. At first, it was just a silhouette, tall, formless, and shrouded in shadow. But as it stepped closer to the edge of the elevator, it became clear that it was not human. It was something else, something ancient, something that didn't belong in our world. The man screamed long and loud, and for the first time, I saw true terror in his eyes. He turned and tried to push the emergency button again, but nothing happened. His movements were frantic, desperate, but it was clear that it was too late. The woman, still in the corner, now turned to face it, her expression calm, unnervingly calm. She wasn't scared. She didn't even seem surprised. She was waiting for something. And then, in the blink of an eye, the creature was upon us. Its form was impossibly long, like it had been stretched and distorted beyond recognition. Its features were dark, shadowed, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning through me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. A voice, low and hollow, echoed in the silence, though the creature's mouth never moved. You shouldn't have come here. The words felt like they were pulling at my very soul, an unnatural force that seemed to consume all light and hope in the room. It was then that I understood. The elevator hadn't taken us to another floor. It wasn't fear anymore, at least, not the kind I had known before. This was something deeper, something primal, something that knew no escape, no reprieve. It was as though I had glimpsed something that no human was ever meant to see, a secret too vast, too terrifying for any of us to comprehend. And yet, despite everything that had happened, I found myself alive. We were all alive, but that didn't mean we were whole. That didn't mean we were unscathed. I looked to the woman in the corner. She hadn't moved, her eyes still staring, distant and unfocused. Her lips were parted, as though she were still whispering to something, someone, in the darkness. I called her name, but she didn't respond. She's not herself, he gasped, his voice raw. She's not one of us anymore. I turned back to her, and the moment I did, something inside me froze. Her eyes, once wide and fearful, were now calm, almost serene, too serene. She wasn't afraid. It was as though she had become one with the darkness we had encountered. Her expression didn't belong to a human anymore. It belonged to something else. She's gone, I whispered. My voice barely made it past my lips, thick with disbelief. I wanted to argue, to tell him that we couldn't just leave her, that she was still in there, somewhere. But I knew, deep down, that what stood before us wasn't her anymore. It couldn't be. The elevator was still, but I could feel the vibrations beneath our feet, the faint humming of the metal walls vibrating from the presence of something that was just out of reach, waiting. The door had closed, sealing us in, but I knew the creature, or whatever it was still there, on the other side, watching us. I wasn't sure how much time had passed. Seconds? Minutes? The world outside had become a blur, and all I could focus on was the deep, gnawing urge to escape, to get out of this place. I had to leave. We had to leave. But how? The man pressed the emergency button again. Nothing happened. The lights flickered, but they didn't go out. It was as if the elevator was mocking us, toying with us. With every press of the button, we were reminded that we were at the mercy of something far beyond our understanding. "I don't know how to get us out," he muttered. "It's like we're stuck. Like there's nowhere to go but down." His words felt true. I realized then that we were trapped not just in this elevator, but in a space that defied all sense of time and place. It wasn't just the building we were in, it was something more. I reached for the woman one last time, my hand trembling as I placed it on her shoulder. Her skin was cold, too cold, and yet there was an unnatural warmth emanating from her, a pulse that didn't belong to any human being I knew. "We can't leave her here," I said, my voice shaking. "We can't save her," the man replied, his eyes wild with panic. She's not like us anymore." I felt a lump rise in my throat. He was right. I knew that now. Whatever had happened in that moment when the creature had appeared, it had changed her. It had changed all of us. I turned away from her, my heart breaking as I did. We couldn't help her. Not anymore. And as much as I hated it, I knew we had to focus on getting out, on surviving. Then, without warning, the elevator jerked to life. It wasn't a smooth movement. It was violent, harsh, like something was forcing it into motion against its will. The man and I staggered, falling against the walls as the elevator shot upward, faster than any elevator should move. My stomach churned with the sensation of weightlessness, but the panic that had consumed me moments before was now overtaken by an overwhelming sense of dread. We were leaving, but where were we going? We were pulled upward so quickly that I could feel the pressure in my chest, the air thickening around us. It wasn't just the movement. It was the sensation that something was following us, chasing us relentlessly, pulling us towards something we couldn't outrun. Then, as abruptly as it had started, the elevator came to a violent halt. The lights flickered again, and for a moment, everything was silent. I looked around. The elevator doors didn't open. There was no sign of the woman. She was gone. It was as though she had never been there at all. I don't know how long we stood there. Time felt like it had been stretched and distorted beyond recognition. The man and I were both standing in the elevator, staring at the doors, our bodies stiff, as if we were waiting for something to happen, waiting for the next twist, the next unexpected shift. But nothing came. The air felt thick and still, pressing down on us with an oppressive weight. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and pressed the button to open the elevator doors. They slid open slowly, but the corridor outside was empty. There was no one waiting for us. No woman. No creature. Nothing. I stepped out first, cautiously, and the man followed me, but we were both hesitant, like two strangers in an unfamiliar world. The hallway beyond the elevator was just as we had left it. Silent, undisturbed. But it felt different now. It felt wrong. I glanced back at the elevator, half expecting it to start moving again, to take us somewhere we couldn't understand. But it stood still, its doors open wide, as if inviting us to step back in and return to whatever nightmare it had brought us through. We stood there for what seemed like an eternity, just staring at the empty hallway. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us dared to ask the questions that were swirling in our heads. Where had the woman gone? Where had the creature taken her? Or had she just vanished? And what were we supposed to do now? We didn't have the answers. All we had were the memories of what had just happened, the images of the creature's eyes, the feel of the air growing thick and heavy as it spoke to us, warning us that we were never meant to be there. I don't know if I can live with this, the man said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. I turned to face him, but his eyes were distant, haunted. His gaze was fixed somewhere beyond me, as though he was seeing things I couldn't. I don't know if I can go back to normal after this, he continued, his voice quieter now. I don't even know what normal is anymore. I felt a chill run through me at his words. He was right. Nothing about what we had just gone through was normal. The world outside felt like it had been permanently altered, like something fundamental had shifted in the very fabric of reality. And we had no idea what the consequences would be if we were ever truly free of whatever we had encountered. The elevator doors slowly slid closed behind us, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I knew it was pointless. Whatever had happened there, whatever had dragged us into that place where the rules of time and space no longer applied, wasn't something we could undo. It wasn't something we could explain, and it wasn't something we could escape. I had no idea if we were still even in the same building, the same dimension, the same reality. But I knew that whatever had taken the woman, whatever had threatened to take us, was still out there, watching, waiting. We both started walking down the hall, silently, our footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. Each step felt heavier than the last, the air around us thick with the weight of unspoken fear. The world beyond the elevator felt cold, distant, as though it no longer belonged to us. It didn't take long before we came to the exit. The doors swung open easily, and we stepped outside into the street. The world was quiet. The night was still. But something was different. I looked up at the sky, and for the first time in my life, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That there was something watching me, just beyond the veil of the familiar world. Something that knew what had happened. Something that had been waiting for us to leave that place. I glanced over at the man. He seemed to feel it too, his eyes wide, his breath shallow. And just before we went our separate ways, he turned to me with a solemn look on his face, his words heavy with something unspoken. "Do you ever wonder if we really left?" he asked. I didn't answer. I couldn't.